You think you know how power works. You think titles and bloodlines mean something when a man stands alone in a marble hall watching his wife smile at someone else. But here's the truth nobody wants to admit. The most dangerous man in the empire isn't the one who controls armies or signs death warrants with indifference. It's the one who finally feels something he can't kill, can't buy, and sure as hell can't control. Stay with me until the end of this, because what starts as a cold political marriage is about to become the kind of obsession that makes emperors nervous and transforms a man everyone fears into someone even he doesn't recognize. And if you've ever wondered what happens when an iceberg finally catches fire, you're about to find out. The wedding took place on the first day of autumn, when the empire's maple leaves turned the color of old blood. Lady Vivian Ashbourne walked down an aisle lined with 2,000 candles in the Grand Cathedral of Valenmore, her silk gown trailing behind her like winter fog, and every single person in that cathedral knew exactly what they were witnessing. Not a love story, a transaction. Adrian Blackwell stood at the altar in his formal military dress, medals gleaming against black fabric, his face carved from the same granite as the cathedral walls. He was 32 years old and had already buried 2 brothers, executed 14 conspirators against the crown, and personally negotiated 3 treaties that prevented civil war. The scar along his left jawline wasn't decorative. Neither was the reputation that preceded him into every room he entered. When Vivian reached the altar, she didn't look at him. She looked past him, through him, at some fixed point beyond the stained glass windows where maybe her real life still existed. Her face was porcelain perfect and completely empty of emotion. She'd learned that trick early, growing up in a family where affection was currency and vulnerability was suicide. The Archbishop's voice echoed off vaulted ceilings as he recited words older than the empire itself, but Adrian barely heard them. He was watching the way Vivian's throat moved when she swallowed, the slight tremor in her hand she thought nobody would notice. She was terrified. Good. At least one of them was still human enough to feel something. When the ceremony ended, they walked back down that aisle as Duke and Duchess Blackwell, and the applause that followed them sounded like distant thunder. Polite, expected, absolutely meaningless. The reception took place in the palace's eastern wing, where 500 of the empire's most powerful families gathered to celebrate a union nobody actually cared about. Adrian stood near the main balcony, a glass of wine in his hand that he hadn't touched, watching Vivian move through the crowd like she'd been born to it. Which she had been. She smiled at elderly countesses and laughed at jokes from minor lords, and somehow made every single person she spoke to feel like they mattered. It was a performance so flawless it almost looked real. Almost. Lord Harrington approached with his son in tow, a kid barely old enough to shave who couldn't stop staring at Vivian like she was the first woman he'd ever seen. "Your Grace, what a magnificent ceremony," Harrington said, his voice dripping with the kind of sincerity that comes from years of lying for a living. "You must be thrilled." Adrian looked at him. Just looked at him. Harrington's smile faltered. "Thrilled," Adrian repeated, tasting the word like poison. "Yes, that's exactly what I am." The kid, William or Wallace or something equally forgettable, cleared his throat. "The Duchess is quite remarkable, Your Grace. You're a fortunate man." Adrian's fingers tightened around the wine glass. He became aware of how easy it would be to crush the delicate crystal, how satisfying the sound would be. Instead, he smiled. It was the smile that made diplomats nervous and enemies reconsider their life choices. "Fortune had nothing to do with it," he said quietly. They moved away quickly after that. Good instincts. The evening dragged on with the mechanical precision of all royal events. Speeches were made. Toasts were raised. Adrian stood beside Vivian during the formal presentations, maintaining exactly the right amount of distance to appear respectful without suggesting actual intimacy. She played her part perfectly. They both did. It wasn't until nearly midnight that something shifted. Adrian was in conversation with the Minister of Finance, half listening to concerns about grain tariffs, when he heard Vivian laugh. Really laugh. Not the practiced, controlled sound she'd been producing all evening, but something genuine and surprised. He turned without thinking. She was standing near the garden entrance, talking to Captain Marcus Thorne of the Imperial Guard. Thorne was young, decorated, handsome in that clean-cut military way that made women stupid. He'd said something that made Vivian cover her mouth with one gloved hand, her eyes bright with actual amusement. Something hot and unfamiliar twisted in Adrian's chest. "Your Grace," the finance minister was saying, "if we could discuss the northern provinces—" "Excuse me," Adrian said, already moving. He crossed the ballroom with the kind of deliberate calm that made people step out of his path without conscious thought. Thorne saw him coming, and his posture went military straight, but his smile didn't fade fast enough. "Captain," Adrian said, his voice perfectly pleasant, "I wasn't aware you'd been assigned to entertainment duties." Thorne's jaw tightened. "Your Grace, I was merely congratulating the Duchess on her—" "On her what, exactly?" Adrian let the question hang there, cold and sharp. Vivian turned to face him fully for the first time all evening. Her expression was unreadable, but something flickered in her eyes. Anger, maybe, or challenge. "The captain was telling me about the new cavalry formations," she said, her voice steady. "I find military strategy fascinating. Do you?" "Yes, I do." They stared at each other for 3 seconds that felt considerably longer. Around them, conversations had quieted. People were watching now, pretending not to. "How fortunate," Adrian said finally, "that you've married into a family with extensive military history. I'm sure we'll have many long evenings discussing formations and strategies." He offered her his arm. It wasn't a request. Vivian hesitated for exactly 1 heartbeat, then placed her hand on his sleeve. Her touch was light, impersonal, and it burned through the fabric like acid. "Good evening, Captain," she said without looking back at Thorne. They walked together toward the main hall, maintaining that same careful distance, and Adrian became aware of how badly he wanted to close it. To pull her closer, to make it absolutely clear to every man in this room that she was his. The intensity of the impulse shocked him. He'd never wanted anything like that before. Wanting things made you weak. Wanting things got you killed. "The Duchess is tired," he announced to no one in particular. "We're retiring for the evening." "Actually," Vivian said quietly, "I'm not." He looked down at her. She looked back, unflinching. "Nevertheless," he said. Something dangerous crossed her face, but she didn't argue. Not here. Not in front of 500 witnesses. Instead, she smiled that perfect empty smile and allowed him to lead her from the ballroom. They didn't speak during the walk to the ducal apartments. Their footsteps echoed off marble floors, punctuated by the distant sound of the reception continuing without them. Guards stood at attention as they passed, their faces carefully blank. The apartments were ridiculous. 12 rooms, all connected, all decorated in the kind of oppressive luxury that came from having too much money and no actual taste. Vivian stopped in the main sitting room, finally pulling her hand from his arm. "So," she said, turning to face him, "this is how it's going to be. This is how what's going to be. You. Controlling every conversation I have, every person I speak to." She wasn't shouting. Her voice was calm, almost clinical. But underneath it, he could hear something brittle waiting to break. "I wasn't controlling anything," Adrian said. "I was removing you from a situation that was becoming inappropriate. Inappropriate." She laughed, and it sounded nothing like the laugh Thorne had earned. "How was it inappropriate? What exactly did I do that crossed some line only you seem to know about? He's a decorated officer. You're the Duchess of Blackwell. There are optics to consider." Optics. Vivian stepped closer, and Adrian realized with something like surprise that she wasn't actually afraid of him. Angry, yes. Frustrated, definitely, but not afraid. "Let me make something very clear, Your Grace," she said, and the formality of the address was deliberate as a knife. "I didn't marry you to become your property. I married you because my family needed the alliance, and you needed the political capital. That was the deal. Nowhere in that deal did I agree to be treated like a child who can't manage her own conversations." Adrian's hands were in fists at his sides. "I don't treat you like a child. No, you treat me like a threat." The accuracy of that landed like a punch. Because she was right, and he couldn't explain why without sounding insane. He couldn't say that watching Thorne make her laugh had made him want to break something. That the idea of her smiling at someone else, looking at someone else with any kind of genuine warmth, made him feel like he was standing on the edge of a cliff with the ground crumbling beneath him. He'd spent his entire adult life building walls between himself and every human emotion that could be weaponized. Love, fear, attachment, they were liabilities, weaknesses. And he'd excise them with surgical precision until there was nothing left but cold calculation and control. But now there was Vivian, and she was looking at him like she could see every one of those walls and was seriously considering what it would take to knock them down. "This is a marriage of convenience," she said quietly. "That means we're convenient for each other. It doesn't mean you own me. I never said I did. Then stop acting like it. He should agree, should apologize even for the display in the ballroom, should establish the boundaries of their arrangement like rational adults, and move forward with the kind of professional distance that had served him well in every other aspect of his life. Instead, he said, 'Did you enjoy it?' Vivian blinked. 'What?' Making him laugh. 'Did you enjoy it?' Her face changed. Something like understanding dawned there, followed quickly by disbelief. 'You're not serious. Answer the question.' 'No.' Vivian shook her head. 'No, we're not doing this. We're not having this conversation.' 'Why not?' 'Because it's insane. Because you don't get to interrogate me about a 30-second conversation with a soldier at our wedding reception. Because whatever this is," she gestured between them, "whatever you're feeling right now, that's your problem, not mine." Adrian took a step toward her. She held her ground. "You think I don't know that?" he said, his voice low. "You think I'm not aware that everything about this is completely irrational. But you're standing there telling me how this marriage works, and I'm telling you that I don't make deals I don't intend to honor. You're my wife. That means something to me, even if it means nothing to you. It means a title and an alliance. That's what we agreed to. Maybe for you." The words came out before he could stop them, and he saw Vivian's expression shift from anger to something more complicated. Confusion. Wariness. And underneath it all, a flicker of something that might have been hope if hope wasn't the most dangerous thing either of them could afford. "What are you saying?" "I don't know," Adrian admitted, and the honesty of it felt like ripping off his own skin. "I don't know what I'm saying. All I know is that watching you laugh with him made me want to do something extremely violent and completely inappropriate, and I can't explain it, and I can't make it stop." Vivian stared at him. Outside, church bells chimed 1 in the morning. Somewhere in the palace, the reception was still going, would probably continue until dawn. But in this room there was only silence, and 2 people who'd signed contracts instead of making promises. "You're jealous," she said finally. "No. You are. You're actually jealous." "I don't get jealous?" "Everyone gets jealous. It's human. I'm not most people." "Clearly." Vivian wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking very young and very tired. "So what now?" "You've admitted to feelings you didn't know you had. I've established that I'm not a possession. Where does that leave us?" Adrian didn't have an answer. He'd negotiated treaties between warring nations, resolved conflicts that had lasted generations, orchestrated political maneuvers so complex they'd filled textbooks. But he had absolutely no idea how to handle whatever this was. "I don't know," he said again. Vivian nodded slowly. "Well, at least you're honest about that." She moved past him toward one of the connecting bedrooms, then paused at the doorway. "For what it's worth," she said without turning around, "I wasn't trying to make you feel anything. I was just trying to survive an evening where everyone was staring at me like I was a prize mare at auction. Captain Thorne was kind, that's all. I know. Then maybe you could remember that tomorrow when you see me talking to someone else. Because I'm going to talk to people, Adrian. I'm going to smile and laugh and engage with the world. And you can either accept that or make both our lives miserable." She closed the door before he could respond. Adrian stood alone in the sitting room, surrounded by ridiculous furniture and the debris of a wedding night that had gone spectacularly wrong. He picked up the nearest object, some kind of decorative vase worth more than most people earned in a year, and weighed it in his hands, considering the satisfaction of watching it shatter against the far wall. Instead, he set it down carefully and walked to the window. The city spread out below him, all lamplight and shadow. His city, his empire, or the part of it he'd sworn to protect when his father died and left him a title he'd never wanted and responsibilities that would have crushed a weaker man. He'd handled all of it. The political intrigue, the assassination attempts, the constant pressure of knowing that one wrong move could destabilize everything. He'd handled it because he didn't allow himself to feel anything that might cloud his judgment. But one evening, one wedding, one woman laughing at someone else's joke, and the entire foundation he'd built was showing cracks. The next morning came too early and too bright. Adrian had slept poorly, which was unusual. He prided himself on the ability to sleep anywhere under any circumstances. a skill developed during military campaigns where comfort was a luxury and paranoia was survival. But he'd spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of Vivian moving around in the adjacent bedroom, and wondering when exactly his life had stopped making sense. Breakfast was waiting in the main dining room. Vivian was already there, dressed in a deep green morning gown that made her eyes look like cut emeralds. She was reading a newspaper and drinking tea, the picture of aristocratic composure. "Good morning," she said without looking up. "Good morning." Adrian sat down across from her. A servant appeared immediately with coffee, then vanished just as quickly. The staff at Blackwell Manor had been trained in the art of being invisible. "We have the charity gala tonight," Vivian said, still focused on her newspaper. "The one benefiting the orphanages in the Eastern District." "I'm aware." "Good. Because apparently the entire royal court will be there, and according to this article, everyone is dying to see how the newlywed Duke and Duchess of Blackwell are settling into married life." She finally looked at him, and her expression was a challenge. "So I suppose we should probably figure out what story we're telling." "The story," Adrian said carefully, "is that we're adjusting to married life like any couple would." Vivian set down her newspaper. "Are we? Adjusting, aren't we? I don't know. Are you planning to drag me away from every conversation I have with a man under the age of 60? Adrian's coffee cup paused halfway to his mouth. "No. No. No!" He set the cup down without drinking. "I'm planning to behave like a rational adult who trusts his wife to manage her own social interactions." Vivian's eyebrows rose. "That's a significant shift from last night. Last night was—" Adrian searched for the right word and found none. An aberration. An aberration. Yes. She studied him for a long moment, and he had the uncomfortable feeling of being dissected, examined for weaknesses. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay. We'll try that." The gala was exactly what Adrian expected. Excessive, performative, and populated by people who cared more about being seen caring than about actually helping anyone. But it raised money for the orphanages, and that mattered, so he attended with the same grim determination he brought to all social obligations. Vivian, on the other hand, seemed to genuinely enjoy it. She moved through the crowd with effortless grace, stopping to speak with everyone from the lowest-ranking nobles to the crown prince himself. She asked questions that suggested actual interest, remembered names and details, and somehow made each conversation look like the most important one in the room. Adrian watched from a strategic position near the main entrance, nodding at appropriate intervals to whoever was speaking to him while tracking Vivian's progress like a hawk tracking prey. Lord Ashford approached her near the refreshment tables. He was old enough to be her father and had buried 3 wives already, which apparently hadn't diminished his enthusiasm for pursuing a 4th. "Duchess Blackwell," Ashford said, his voice carrying across the noise. "You look absolutely radiant." "You're too kind, Lord Ashford." "Not at all. In fact, I was just saying to the prince that Blackwell is the luckiest man in the empire." Vivian's smile didn't waver, but Adrian saw her shoulders tighten fractionally. "I'll be sure to tell him you said so. Please do. And if you ever find yourself in need of company while your husband is occupied with affairs of state, my estate is always open." "That's quite generous." "I'm a generous man." Ashford stepped closer, and Adrian's vision tunneled. He was moving before the rational part of his brain could intervene, crossing the ballroom with the kind of predatory focus that made people step out of his way without understanding why. "Lord Ashford," he said, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a blade. "What a pleasant surprise." Ashford turned, and whatever he saw in Adrian's face made him take an involuntary step backward. "Your Grace, I was just complimenting your wife on how radiant she looks." "Yes, I heard. How observant of you." The temperature in their immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees. People were noticing now, conversations faltering as attention shifted toward them. Vivian placed a hand on Adrian's arm. "Darling," she said, the endearment sounding foreign in her mouth. Lord Ashford was just being kind. Adrian looked down at her hand, then back at Ashford. The old man had gone slightly pale. "Of course," Adrian said softly. How could I possibly object to kindness? But there was nothing kind in his voice, and Ashford knew it. "I should," the Lord began, then seemed to lose track of his sentence. "I should pay my respects to the Archbishop. If you'll excuse me." He fled, actually fled, threading through the crowd with the urgency of a man escaping a burning building. Vivian's hand tightened on Adrian's arm, her nails digging in through the fabric of his jacket. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "Now." She didn't wait for a response, just turned and walked toward the garden entrance with the clear expectation that he would follow. He did. The gardens were illuminated by paper lanterns strung between trees, creating pools of warm light interrupted by deep shadow. Vivian walked until they were far enough from the gala that the music and conversation became background noise. Then she rounded on him. "What the hell was that?" "That was Lord Ashford being inappropriate with my wife. He was paying me a compliment. He was propositioning you." Vivian's laugh was sharp and bitter. "You think I can't handle being propositioned? You think I haven't spent my entire life navigating men who think their title or their money or their age gives them the right to say whatever they want? I don't need you swooping in like some... Like what? Like some jealous husband who actually cares." The words hit him with unexpected force, because she was right. He was acting like a jealous husband. He was acting like someone who cared deeply and possessively about the woman standing in front of him, glaring at him with furious eyes and clenched fists. And the worst part was, he did care. When the hell had that happened? "I told you," Vivian continued, her voice shaking slightly, "I told you last night that I need to be able to interact with people without you intervening every 5 minutes. And you said you understood. You said you'd behave like a rational adult." That lasted less than 24 hours. He was being inappropriate. So what? So what if he was? "I can handle inappropriate, Adrian. What I can't handle is my husband treating every man I speak to like a threat that needs to be eliminated." "They're not threats to you. They're threats to me." The admission came out raw and unguarded, and Vivian went very still. "What does that mean?" Adrian ran a hand through his hair, destroying whatever remained of his carefully maintained appearance. "It means I spent 32 years not giving a damn about anyone or anything except duty and survival. And then I married you, and suddenly I can't stop thinking about who you're talking to and what they're saying and whether you're smiling at them the way you smiled at Thorne last night. It means I'm losing my mind over something that shouldn't matter, and I don't know how to make it stop." Vivian stared at him. Her anger had shifted into something more complicated, softer around the edges. "You're serious." "Unfortunately, you actually..." She trailed off, seeming to struggle with the concept. "You have feelings for me, apparently. But we've been married for 1 day. I'm aware of the timeline. And you didn't even want to marry me. You made that very clear during the negotiations." Adrian stepped closer, and this time she didn't retreat. "I didn't want to marry anyone," he said quietly. "Marriage was a political necessity, not a choice. But then you walked down that aisle looking like you were headed to your own execution, and something in my chest felt like it was cracking open. And it's only gotten worse since then. Worse. Worse. Better. I don't know. All I know is that I can't stop watching you, can't stop wanting to be near you, can't stop hating every man who makes you laugh or smile or look at them with anything resembling warmth. And yes, I know that's irrational and possessive and probably several other adjectives you could throw at me. But it's the truth." Vivian raised one hand to her mouth, fingers pressed against her lips like she was physically holding back words. "I don't know what to do with that," she said finally. "Neither do I." They stood facing each other in the lantern-lit garden, two people who'd signed contracts and made vows without understanding what they were actually promising. Around them the gala continued, oblivious to the small war being waged in the shadows. "I'm not good at this," Adrian said. "At feelings. At caring about someone who could destroy me just by walking away. I'm not going to destroy you. You could." Vivian lowered her hand. Her eyes were bright, and he couldn't tell if it was anger or something else entirely. "Then I guess we're both taking risks we didn't plan on." Before he could respond, voices echoed from the garden entrance. Multiple voices, getting closer. "We should go back inside," Vivian said. "People will talk." "Let them." She smiled, small and sad. "You say that now, but you're the Duke of Blackwell. You care about optics and reputation more than anyone I've ever met. I care about you more." The words hung between them, impossible to take back. Vivian's smile faded. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't say things like that unless you mean them. I mean everything I say. That's what I'm afraid of. She turned and walked back toward the gala, leaving Adrian standing alone among the lanterns. He should follow her, should return to the performance they were both so good at maintaining. Instead, he stood there feeling something he hadn't felt since he was 15 years old, and his father had explained exactly what being a Blackwell meant. Fear. Not fear of death or failure or political ruin. Fear of something infinitely more dangerous. Fear of caring so much about one person that their absence could unmake everything he'd built. And when he finally did walk back into the ballroom, scanning the crowd until he found Vivian near the orchestra, laughing politely at something Prince Cedric was saying while her eyes remained absolutely empty, Adrian understood with perfect clarity that he was already lost. Because the Duke of Blackwell, the man who'd never wanted anything he couldn't control, now wanted something, someone, who could choose to leave him at any moment, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do to stop her. The morning after the gala, Adrian woke to an empty bed and the distant sound of Vivian moving through the adjacent rooms. He'd barely slept. Again. 3 nights of marriage and his insomnia had become chronic, fueled by the constant awareness of her proximity and the maddening knowledge that proximity meant nothing without permission. He found her in the breakfast room, already dressed in riding clothes. Dark blue velvet that made her look like some kind of warrior princess preparing for battle. "You ride," he said. She glanced up from her coffee. "Most mornings." "Is that going to be a problem?" "No." "Then why are you asking?" "Because I didn't know. Because apparently there's an entire list of things I don't know about my own wife." Vivian set down her cup with deliberate care. "We've been married 3 days, Adrian. There's probably a lot we don't know about each other." He sat across from her, and the servant who appeared with his coffee vanished before he could acknowledge them. The staff had gotten very good at reading the temperature in any room he occupied. "Tell me something," he said. "What?" "Something I don't know, something real." She studied him with those green eyes that saw too much. "Why?" "Because I want to." Vivian leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "That's not a reason. It's the only reason you're getting." A smile ghosted across her face, there and gone so fast he almost missed it. "Fine. I speak 4 languages. I hate tea but drink it anyway because that's what duchesses do. I read military histories for fun, which is why I actually was interested in what Captain Thorne had to say about cavalry formations. And I think this marriage is probably going to destroy both of us if we don't figure out how to be honest with each other." The last part landed like a knife between his ribs, clean and precise and completely accurate. "Your turn," she said. Adrian considered lying. Considered giving her something safe and meaningless that wouldn't expose the raw nerve she'd somehow found in 3 days of proximity. Instead, he said, "I don't know how to do this. Any of this. I've spent my entire adult life treating emotions like tactical weaknesses, and now I'm sitting here wanting to know what languages you speak and what you think about when you're alone, and whether you hate me as much as you probably should." Vivian's expression shifted, softened, maybe. Or maybe that was wishful thinking. "I don't hate you," she said quietly. "I'm frustrated with you. Angry, sometimes, confused most of the time. But I don't hate you. That's something." "Is it?" "It's more than I expected." Outside, horses whinnied in the stable yard. Vivian looked toward the sound with unmistakable longing. "Go," Adrian said. "Ride. I have meetings all morning anyway." She hesitated. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." But as she stood to leave, he found himself standing too. Found himself crossing the space between them before his brain could override the impulse. "Vivian," he said, and she stopped. "Yes." "Be careful." Her eyebrows rose. "I've been riding since I was 6. "I know." "Be careful anyway." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face changed. Recognition, maybe. Understanding that his concern had nothing to do with her riding ability and everything to do with the irrational need to keep her safe from threats that didn't exist. "Okay," she said finally. "I'll be careful." The imperial court sessions started 2 hours later in the Hall of Governance, a massive chamber designed to make everyone except the emperor feel insignificant. Adrian attended because attendance was mandatory for dukes and because policy decisions made here affected everything from trade routes to military deployments. What he didn't expect was to see Vivian there. She sat in the gallery reserved for nobility, Positioned between Lady Markham and Countess Pellier, both women old enough to be fixtures of court politics and vicious enough to have survived 3 different emperors. They were talking to her like she was one of them, like she belonged. Adrian took his seat among the other dukes and tried to focus on the discussion about grain subsidies for the northern provinces. Failed completely, because Vivian was visible in his peripheral vision and he couldn't stop tracking her movements. The way she leaned forward when the Minister of Agriculture spoke, the way she made notes in a small leather journal, the way Lord Pemberton, seated 1 row behind her, kept finding excuses to lean close and whisper commentary. Pemberton was 35, unmarried, and widely considered one of the Empire's most eligible bachelors. He was also charming in a way Adrian had never been and never would be. "Your Grace," the Emperor's Chancellor said, "we'd value your perspective on the proposed tariff modifications." Adrian forced his attention back to the session. "I think the modifications are reasonable, provided we adjust the enforcement timeline to account for harvest season variations." The discussion continued. Policy minutiae that normally engaged his strategic mind but today felt like noise. Because Pemberton was still whispering to Vivian, and she was smiling. Actually smiling. The thing about jealousy that nobody tells you is how physical it becomes. How it sits in your chest like broken glass, cutting deeper with every breath. How it makes your hands want to do violence to people who've done nothing wrong except make your wife smile. Adrian had killed men in combat, had signed execution orders without losing sleep, had orchestrated political maneuvers that destroyed entire families. But sitting in that chamber watching Vivian laugh at something Pemberton said, he felt more dangerous than he'd ever felt on any battlefield. When the session finally adjourned, he intercepted her before Pemberton could. "Duchess," he said, deliberately formal, "I wasn't aware you planned to attend." Vivian looked up at him, and her smile faded. "I wasn't aware I needed permission." "You don't? Then why does it sound like a question?" "Because I'm curious about what prompted the sudden interest in agricultural policy." Her eyes narrowed. "Maybe I care about how the Empire is governed? Or maybe I just wanted to see what you do all day besides brood in your study." Behind her, Pemberton was watching their exchange with undisguised interest. Adrian wanted to tell him to leave, wanted to make it very clear that his presence wasn't welcome. Instead, he said, "We should discuss this elsewhere. We're not discussing anything. You're interrogating me in a public hallway about attending a court session that's open to all nobility. That's not a discussion." "Lady Vivian," Pemberton interjected, his voice warm and concerned. "Is everything all right?" Adrian turned to look at him. Just looked at him, the same look that had made enemy commanders surrender without a fight. "Everything is fine, Lord Pemberton," Vivian said quickly. "Thank you for your concern." "Of course. And thank you for the delightful conversation. I do hope we can continue it at the Chancellor's dinner tomorrow evening. I'm looking forward to it." Pemberton bowed slightly and walked away, and Adrian felt his control fraying like old rope under too much weight. "The Chancellor's dinner," he said flatly. "Yes. It's a monthly gathering. I was invited." "By whom?" "By the Chancellor himself. Apparently he's heard I have opinions about trade reform and wanted to include me in the discussion, and Pemberton just happened to be there to whisper commentary in your ear for the entire session." Vivian's face went cold. He was explaining parliamentary procedures I'm not familiar with yet. Because unlike you, some people are willing to help me navigate this world, instead of just expecting me to figure it out alone. That hit harder than she probably intended. Because she was right. He'd brought her into this life and then abandoned her to navigate it alone while he stood on the sidelines cataloging every man who came near her. "I'm sorry," he said. She blinked. "What?" I said, "I'm sorry. You're right. I should have been the one helping you understand how court works instead of what? Treating me like a problem to be managed." "Yes." They stood in the emptying hallway, people flowing around them like water around stones. Adrian was aware of the attention they were attracting, the whispers that would become gossip by evening, the Duke and Duchess of Blackwell having a public disagreement less than a week into marriage. He didn't care. "Come with me tomorrow," Vivian said suddenly. "To the Chancellor's dinner. You want me there. I want to stop feeling like we're living separate lives that occasionally intersect. So yes, come with me." "All right." Her surprise was visible. Just like that. Just like that. She studied him for a moment, suspicion warring with something softer. Then we should probably go home before we give the gossips any more material. Agreed. They walked together through the palace corridors, maintaining the careful distance that had become their default. But when they reached the carriage, Adrian offered his hand to help her up. She took it, and for 5 seconds her fingers wrapped around his felt like the most important thing in the world. The Chancellor's dinner the following evening was exactly what Adrian expected, a carefully orchestrated political theater where alliances were forged and broken over 7 courses of food nobody actually tasted. He arrived with Vivian, and the whispers started immediately. They'd coordinated, whether intentionally or not. She wore burgundy silk that made her look like something dangerous and beautiful. He wore black, as always, but had made an effort with his appearance that his valet had nearly fainted over. "Your Grace, Duchess Blackwell," the Chancellor greeted them warmly. "What a pleasure. We were just discussing the proposed reforms to the eastern trade routes." "How fascinating," Vivian said, and she actually sounded interested. "I'd love to hear more about the impact on merchant guilds." The Chancellor beamed. Finally, someone who understands the nuances. Adrian followed them into the dining room and immediately catalogued the seating arrangement. Vivian was positioned between Pemberton and Count Aldrich, an older statesman with a reputation for progressive policies and wandering hands. He was seated across from her, which meant he had a perfect view of everything that happened. Dinner began with the usual small talk. Weather, horses, the upcoming hunting festival. Adrian participated minimally, his attention split between the conversation and watching Aldrich's hand creep progressively closer to Vivian's chair. "So, Duchess," Pemberton was saying, "I heard you speak Valerian. That's quite rare among our nobility." "My mother was Valerian," Vivian explained. "She insisted I learn the language and customs." "How wonderfully cosmopolitan. You must tell me more." Adrian's wineglass was in danger of shattering in his grip. The conversation flowed around them, touching on everything from tax reform to military appointments. Vivian held her own remarkably well, offering insights that made even the most cynical politicians pause and reconsider their positions. She was brilliant. Adrian had known she was intelligent, but watching her dissect complex policy issues with the same precision he brought to military strategy was revelation. It was also torture, because Pemberton kept leaning closer, kept touching her arm to emphasize points, kept making her laugh with observations that Adrian would never think to make. And Aldrich. Aldrich's hand had progressed from proximity to actual contact, resting on the back of her chair in a way that suggested ownership. Adrian set down his fork with enough force that conversation faltered. "Is something wrong, Your Grace?" the Chancellor asked. "Not at all. Please, continue." But his eyes were on Aldrich, and Aldrich was smart enough to move his hand, marginally. The meal progressed with glacial slowness. Course after course, while Adrian sat there watching other men orbit his wife like she was the sun, and they were desperate for warmth. By the time dessert arrived, his jaw ached from clenching it. "I think," Vivian announced during a lull in conversation, "that the proposed trade reforms would benefit significantly from input from merchant representatives. We're making policy about people who have no voice in these discussions." "An idealistic perspective," Aldrich said, his tone patronizing. "But the reality of governance requires practical consideration of what? Of excluding the people most affected by our decisions because we assume they lack the sophistication to contribute meaningfully. That's not practical, Count. That's lazy." Silence fell across the table. Nobody spoke to Count Aldrich that way. Nobody, except apparently Vivian. Adrian felt something that might have been pride cutting through the jealousy. She was magnificent when she was angry, all fire and conviction with none of the careful diplomacy that usually govern noble discourse. "Lady Vivian," Pemberton said carefully, "while I appreciate your passion, you must understand that Count Aldrich has decades of experience in maintaining systems that benefit the nobility at the expense of everyone else." "Yes, I understand perfectly." Aldrich's face had gone red. "Your Grace," he said, looking at Adrian, "perhaps you might explain to your wife the complexities of—" "My wife," Adrian interrupted quietly, "understands complexity better than most people in this room. And she's right. We've been making policy in a vacuum for too long." Vivian's eyes snapped to his, surprise and something else flickering there. "Well," the Chancellor said, clearly delighted by the drama, This has certainly been an illuminating dinner. Perhaps we should move to the drawing room for brandy. The party dispersed with the herding instinct of people desperate to escape awkward situations. Adrian found himself standing near the terrace doors while Vivian was surrounded by a cluster of younger nobles, all eager to hear more of her revolutionary ideas about governance. Pemberton was among them, of course, positioned at her elbow like he belonged there. "Your wife is quite something," a voice said beside him. Adrian turned to find Crown Prince Cedric standing there, brandy in hand, expression amused. "She is," Adrian agreed carefully. "Politics with the Crown Prince required precision. I can see why you're so protective of her. I'm not—" "Please. The entire court has been talking about nothing else for 3 days. The cold Duke of Blackwell, suddenly unable to let his wife out of his sight. It's very romantic, also very transparent." Adrian's hands were fists at his sides. "I don't know what you're referring to," Cedric laughed. "Of course you don't. Just like you're not currently calculating exactly how many steps it would take to cross this room and remove Pemberton from her immediate vicinity. He's being inappropriate. He's being charming. There's a difference." Cedric took a sip of his brandy. "You know what your problem is, Blackwell. I'm sure you're about to tell me. You've spent so long being untouchable that you've forgotten how to want something you can't control. And now you've married a woman who's quickly becoming the most interesting person at court, and every man here can see it, including you." The observation was too accurate to dismiss. Adrian watched Vivian laugh at something one of the young lords said, watched her tilt her head in that way that suggested genuine interest, and felt that now familiar sensation of the ground shifting beneath him. "What would you suggest?" he said finally. "Talk to her. Actually talk to her, not at her. Stop treating every interaction she has as a threat and start treating her like a partner. And if that doesn't work," Cedric smiled, "then I suppose you'll have to accept that the most powerful position in the Empire is at her feet, not in your council chambers." He walked away before Adrian could respond, leaving him standing alone near the terrace, watching his wife charm the entire room without even trying. The ride home was silent. Vivian stared out the carriage window at the night-dark city while Adrian sat across from her, cataloging all the ways the evening had gone wrong. When they arrived at Blackwell Manor, she headed straight for her rooms without a word. "Vivian," he called after her. She stopped but didn't turn around. "What? You were right tonight. About the trade reforms. About including merchant representatives. I know I was right, and you handled Aldrich perfectly. I don't need your approval, Adrian. I know. I'm giving it anyway." She turned then, and her face was tired, worn down by something more than just a long dinner. "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. "Because I can't figure it out. One minute you're defending me, the next you're interrogating me about who I talk to. You say you want honesty, but you can't stand it when I'm honest with other people. You want me to be your wife, but you treat me like I'm something you need to protect from the entire world, including myself." Adrian crossed the space between them. "I want you to be happy." Her laugh was bitter. "No, you don't. You want me to be safe. There's a difference. They're not mutually exclusive, aren't they? Because from where I'm standing, your version of keeping me safe looks a lot like keeping me isolated. That's not— It is. You want me smiling at you and no one else, laughing at your observations and ignoring everyone else's. You want me to exist in this little bubble where you're the only person who matters. And Adrian, I can't live like that. Then tell me how you can live. Tell me what you need, and I'll give it to you." Vivian's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I need you to trust me. I need you to believe that I can be around other men without it meaning anything, that I can have conversations and friendships and a life outside this marriage without it threatening what we're trying to build." "What are we trying to build?" "I don't know yet, but we're not going to figure it out if you keep treating me like I'm going to disappear the second you stop watching." Adrian wanted to argue, wanted to explain that the fear of losing her wasn't rational, wasn't something he could control or negotiate away, that watching other men orbit her felt like standing on the edge of a precipice waiting for the inevitable fall. Instead, he said, "I'll try." "Try what?" "To trust you, to give you space, to stop treating every man who makes you smile like he's a threat to national security." A smile ghosted across her face despite the tears. "That's a low bar, Adrian." "I know, but it's a start." She nodded slowly. Okay, we'll start there." She turned toward her rooms again, then paused at the doorway. For what it's worth, she said without looking back, Pemberton's charming, but he's not interesting. Aldrich is a pompous ass. And the only person at that entire dinner who made me feel anything real was you, when you defended me to the Count. Then she disappeared into her rooms, leaving Adrian standing alone in the hallway with the echo of her words and the dangerous, terrifying feeling that maybe they were building something after all. The next 2 weeks passed in a careful dance of proximity and distance. Adrian attended every public event Vivian attended, but he stayed back, watched from strategic positions while she navigated court politics with increasing confidence. It was excruciating. At the Opera House Gala, he watched Lord Hartley present her with roses and offer his private box for the performance. Vivian accepted graciously and spent the evening in conversation with Hartley and his mother, laughing at stories about their country estate, while Adrian sat 3 boxes away, his hands gripping the armrests hard enough to leave marks. At the museum opening, young Lord Ashton spent 40 minutes explaining art history to Vivian like she hadn't spent years studying it herself. She listened with perfect patience, asked insightful questions, and never once looked in Adrian's direction while he stood near a marble statue, contemplating whether throttling someone in a public space would technically count as murder. At the Spring Garden party, Captain Thorne returned from deployment and immediately sought her out, and they spent the entire afternoon discussing military campaigns, while Adrian pretended to care about a conversation about breeding horses happening 3 feet away. He was actually trying to give her the space she'd asked for, to trust that her interactions with other men meant nothing. But every smile she gave them felt like something stolen. Every laugh was a knife twisting deeper. And the worst part was knowing she was right, that his jealousy was irrational and possessive, and exactly the kind of toxic behavior he'd always despised in other men, didn't make it stop. The breaking point came at the hunting festival, 3 weeks into their marriage. The festival was tradition going back centuries. 3 days in the imperial hunting grounds where nobility pretended to be outdoorsmen and conducted actual business in elaborately decorated tents. Adrian normally avoided it, but Vivian had expressed interest, so here they were. She looked incredible in riding clothes, hair braided back, eyes bright with genuine excitement. This was her element, the kind of physical competition she'd grown up with and clearly missed. The hunt itself was structured chaos. Groups of riders pursuing deer through wooded terrain, while judges tracked points for style and skill. Adrian rode with the Duke's contingent, staying back from the main action because his goal was observation, not participation. What he observed made his blood pressure dangerous. Vivian had been assigned to a mixed group that included Pemberton, naturally, and also Prince Cedric, who'd apparently decided to participate this year. The prince was an accomplished rider, and he and Vivian made a striking pair as they navigated the terrain with the kind of synchronized precision that came from natural talent. They were laughing, racing each other through open meadows, taking jumps in parallel, clearly enjoying themselves. Adrian's horse seemed to sense his mood, becoming increasingly difficult to control as the afternoon progressed. "Your Grace," his riding companion said nervously, "perhaps we should return to camp." "No." "But, sir, I said no. He watched Vivian clear a fence that made half the other riders balk. Watched Cedric congratulate her with a hand on her shoulder that lingered too long. Watched Pemberton ride up beside her and say something that made her throw her head back laughing. And something inside him just snapped. He spurred his horse forward, cutting through groups of riders with single-minded focus. People shouted protests as he passed too close, disrupted carefully orchestrated hunts, but he didn't care. He reached Vivian's group just as they were preparing for another jump. "Duchess," he said, his voice cutting across their laughter. "A word." Vivian turned and her smile faded. "Adrian, what are you—" "Now, Your Grace," Cedric said, his tone amused but edged with warning. "We're in the middle of— I'm aware. This won't take long." He dismounted before anyone could protest and walked straight to Vivian's horse, looked up at her with something in his face that made her dismount without argument. "Excuse us," he said to the group, then took Vivian's arm and led her away from the trail into a clearing hidden by old growth trees. "What the hell are you doing?" she hissed the moment they were out of earshot. "You can't just what? Can't interrupt when my wife is practically throwing herself at the crown prince in front of the entire imperial court?" "Throwing myself—" Her voice went dangerously quiet. "I was riding. That's what people do at a hunting festival. You were flirting. I was having fun. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I was watching, it looked like you were enjoying his attention quite a bit. Vivian pulled her arm free. You're unbelievable. You promised to give me space, to trust me. That lasted, what, 2 weeks? I trusted you. And you took that trust and used it to what? To exist. To have conversations. To enjoy myself at a public event. God forbid I smile at someone who isn't you. He grabbed a public horse and pulled Vivian onto his saddle before anyone could react, one arm locked around her waist as he spurred the mount away from the hunting grounds entirely. Adrian, she was saying, her voice tight with fury, put me down right now or so help me. We need to talk. We needed to talk in the clearing. We needed to talk back at camp. We don't need to abduct each other in front of half the nobility. I'm not abducting you. I'm removing us from a situation before I do something I'll regret. Like what? Like publicly humiliate both of us. Mission accomplished. He rode until they reached a stream far enough from the festival that the sounds of horns and dogs faded to nothing. Then he stopped and dismounted, helping her down with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline and rage and fear. You want to know what I almost did, he said, his voice raw. I almost challenged the crown prince, the heir to the empire, over watching him touch your shoulder. Vivian stared at him. You can't be serious. Do I look like I'm joking? You look insane. Maybe I am. Maybe that's what you've done to me in 3 weeks of marriage. Turn me into someone who can't think straight when you're near someone else. That's not love, Adrian. That's obsession. Then what do you call it? What do you call lying awake every night knowing you're 30 feet away, but might as well be on another continent? What do you call walking into a room and immediately searching for you before I even register what meeting I'm supposed to be in? What do you call this feeling like my chest is being crushed every time you smile at someone who isn't me? I call it unhealthy. The word hit like a slap. Because she was right. Everything about what he felt was unhealthy and destructive and exactly the kind of behavior that destroyed people. I know, he said quietly. I know it's wrong, but I don't know how to make it stop. Vivian's anger seemed to deflate. She sat down on a fallen log near the stream, suddenly looking exhausted. You can't keep doing this. You can't keep treating me like I'm yours to control. You are mine. The words came out before he could stop them, possessive and absolute. No, Vivian said firmly. I'm not. I'm your wife. That's a partnership, not ownership. Then what do you want me to do? How do I stop feeling like I'm losing my mind every time another man makes you laugh? You start by understanding that their laughter doesn't take anything away from you. That my existing in the world, having friends and conversations and experiences that don't include you, doesn't mean I'm choosing them over you. But it feels like you are. Then that's your problem to solve, not mine. They sat in silence, broken only by running water and distant birdsong. Adrian felt something fracturing inside him. The careful control he'd maintained his entire life, cracking under the weight of emotions he'd never allowed himself to feel. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, how to care about someone this much and not destroy everything. Vivian looked at him, really looked at him, and her expression softened fractionally. Then maybe you need to figure out why you're so terrified of losing something you barely let yourself have. The observation cut too close to truth. Because she was right. He'd spent 3 weeks holding her at arm's length while simultaneously losing his mind over every man who came near her, wanting her desperately while doing nothing to actually build a real relationship. Tell me how, he said. Tell me how to do this differently. Stop treating me like a possession. Start treating me like a person who chose to marry you and meant the vows we took, even though you didn't choose, even though this was arranged. I could have refused. My family would have been furious, but I could have said no. I didn't. Why not? Vivian stood, brushing dirt from her riding clothes. Because despite everything, despite your reputation and your cold demeanor and the fact that you scare most people you meet, I saw something in you. During the negotiations, in the way you looked at me like I was a puzzle you couldn't solve instead of just another political asset. What did you see? Someone lonely. Someone so used to being untouchable that he'd forgotten what it felt like to want to be touched. Adrian stood too, closing the distance between them. And now I see someone terrified, someone fighting against feelings he thinks make him weak. And I see someone who could be extraordinary if he stopped trying to control everything and just let himself feel. She reached up and touched his face, fingers gentle against the scar along his jaw. I'm not going anywhere, Adrian, but you need to decide if you're going to keep me at a distance or actually let me in. You can't do both. Before he could respond, distant shouts echoed through the woods. Search parties, probably. Looking for the Duke and Duchess who'd disappeared from the hunting festival. We should go back, Vivian said, dropping her hand. People will worry. Let them. Adrian. 5 more minutes, please. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. 5 minutes. They stood together by the stream, not touching but close enough that he could feel her warmth, smell the scent of horse and leather, and something uniquely her. And Adrian made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown darkness. When we go back, he said quietly, I'm not going to apologize for pulling you away. I'm not going to pretend that seeing you with them didn't make me want to do violence, but I'm going to try, really try, to give you the space you need without losing my mind in the process. That's all I'm asking. And Vivian, if I fail at this, if I can't be the man you need me to be, her eyes met his, clear and direct, then we'll figure it out together. That's what marriage means. The search party found them 20 minutes later, and the gossip erupted before they even made it back to camp. The Duke of Blackwell, so consumed with jealousy over his new wife that he'd literally abducted her mid-hunt. The Duchess, either wildly in love or trapped in a nightmare, depending on who you asked. By the time they returned to the festival grounds, the story had already grown legs. Prince Cedric watched their arrival with undisguised amusement. Pemberton looked concerned. Count Aldrich looked vindicated, like this confirmed everything he'd suspected about Adrian's lack of control. Adrian didn't care, because Vivian's hand was in his as they dismounted, and she hadn't let go. But late that night, alone in his study with a glass of whiskey he wasn't drinking, Adrian finally admitted what he'd been avoiding since the wedding. He was in love with his wife, completely, irrationally, destructively in love. And he had absolutely no idea how to do anything about it except watch her slip further away with every desperate attempt to hold on. The whiskey sat untouched on Adrian's desk while he stared at documents that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Financial reports, military deployments, trade agreements, all of it meaningless compared to the realization burning a hole through his chest. He was in love with Vivian. Not the careful, manageable affection he'd allowed himself to feel for subordinates or allies. Not the strategic appreciation he had for useful political connections. Real love. The kind that made men stupid. The kind that got people killed. His father would have been disgusted. A knock interrupted his spiral into self-loathing. Enter. Marcus, his personal secretary, stepped inside looking apologetic. Your Grace, the Minister of Defense is requesting an urgent meeting, something about troop movements near the northern border. When? Within the hour, if possible. Adrian stood, grateful for the distraction. Tell him I'll be there in 30 minutes. Marcus hesitated. There's also a message from the Duchess. She wanted you to know she's attending Lady Pemberton's salon this afternoon. Of course she was, because Pemberton's mother hosted the most influential gathering of noblewomen in the capital, and Vivian was nothing if not strategic about building her network. Thank you, Marcus. The secretary left, and Adrian allowed himself exactly 10 seconds to imagine Pemberton using the salon as an excuse to monopolize Vivian's attention. Then he shoved the image aside and focused on getting dressed for a meeting that would hopefully involve concrete threats he could actually do something about. The northern border situation was deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated. The neighboring kingdom of Valorian had been amassing troops for weeks, and their ambassadors' increasingly hostile rhetoric suggested military action was imminent. We need to reinforce the mountain passes, General Rothschild was saying, spreading maps across the conference table. If Valorian moves on the trade routes, we'll lose access to iron shipments by winter. Adrian studied the terrain, his mind automatically calculating supply lines and defensive positions. What about the 3rd Regiment? They're stationed less than 50 miles from the primary crossing. Already deployed, the general confirmed, but they're spread thin, covering multiple access points. The discussion continued for 2 hours, dissecting strategy and logistics with the kind of cold precision Adrian had always excelled at. This was his element: clear objectives, quantifiable threats, solutions that didn't require understanding human emotion. By the time they adjourned, preliminary deployment orders had been issued and contingency plans established. Adrian felt more centered than he had in weeks. That lasted approximately 20 minutes. He was reviewing the finalized orders in his study when Marcus appeared again, this time looking genuinely distressed. Your Grace, I apologize for the interruption, but there's a situation. What kind of situation? The Duchess. There's been an incident at Lady Pemberton's salon. Adrian was on his feet before Marcus finished speaking. What happened? I don't have all the details, but apparently there was some kind of confrontation. The Duchess left abruptly, and Lady Markham sent word that you should return home immediately. He didn't remember the carriage ride back to Blackwell Manor. One moment he was in the palace, the next he was striding through his own entrance hall, demanding answers from servants who looked terrified. Vivian was in the drawing room, standing near the window with her back to the door. Her posture was rigid, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. What happened? Adrian said. She didn't turn around. Nothing that concerns you. Vivian, I said it doesn't concern you. He crossed the room in 3 strides, positioning himself where he could see her face. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry, and there was something in her expression he'd never seen before. Not anger, not fear. Something colder and infinitely more dangerous. Tell me what happened. Why? So you can swoop in and handle it like you handle everything else. Make decisions about my life without consulting me. That's not what It's exactly what you do. You pull me away from conversations because you've decided they're inappropriate. You interrogate me about who I talk to and why. You treat me like I'm incapable of navigating my own existence without your constant supervision. Adrian forced himself to take a breath. Whatever happened at that salon, tell me. Please. Vivian laughed, and it sounded broken. You want to know what happened? Lady Ashford stood up in front of 30 noblewomen and announced that I was clearly having an affair with Lord Pemberton, that everyone could see how I threw myself at him, how I used my position to seduce younger men, how I was making a mockery of our marriage. The room tilted slightly. What? She called me a whore, Adrian, in a room full of the Empire's most influential women, said I was an embarrassment to the Blackwell name, and that you were a fool for marrying someone so far beneath you. He was going to kill her, literally kill her. The planning started automatically, challenging her husband to a duel, destroying their family's financial holdings, ruining them so completely they'd be begging in the streets within a month. What did you say? I said nothing. I stood up and left. Because anything I said would have made it worse. You should have defended yourself. How? By explaining that my own husband is so insanely jealous that he's created the perfect foundation for exactly this kind of rumor. By admitting that every time someone sees you glaring at men I talk to, it reinforces the narrative that there must be something to hide. That's not... It is. Don't you see? Your jealousy isn't protecting me, Adrian. It's destroying my reputation. People see how you watch me, how you react when other men come near, and they assume I must be doing something to provoke it. I never thought... No, you didn't think. You just felt and acted and assumed that was enough. She finally turned to fully face him, and the devastation in her eyes was worse than anything he could have imagined. I can't do this anymore, she said quietly. I can't keep living in this marriage where you claim to care about me but won't trust me, where every friendship I try to build gets poisoned by your suspicion, where my reputation gets destroyed because you can't control your own emotions. What are you saying? I'm saying I need space, real space, not your version where you give me 10 feet of physical distance while tracking my every movement. How much space? I'm going to my family's estate. For a few weeks at least. The words hit like a physical blow. No, it's not a request. I said no. We can work through this. Whatever happened at that salon, we'll handle it together. Vivian's voice went sharp. There is no we, Adrian. There's you making decisions and me dealing with the consequences. That's not fair, isn't it? Tell me one major decision you've made about our marriage that involved actually consulting me. One choice where you asked what I wanted instead of just deciding what was best. He opened his mouth and found he had no answer. Because she was right. Every intervention, every protective gesture, every moment of jealousy-driven action had been his choice. His decision. His need to control a situation that terrified him. I'll change, he said, and heard the desperation in his own voice. I'll do better, Just don't leave. You've been saying that for weeks. And maybe you mean it. But meaning something and actually doing it are very different things. She walked past him toward the door, and he caught her arm without thinking. She went very still. Let go of me. Adrian, let go. He released her immediately, and she rubbed her wrist even though he hadn't gripped hard enough to hurt. The gesture felt like an accusation. I'll have my things packed tonight, she said. I'll leave tomorrow morning. Vivian, please. Goodbye, Adrian. She left, and he stood alone in the drawing room, listening to her footsteps fade down the hallway. Every instinct screamed at him to follow, to argue, to physically prevent her from leaving if necessary. Instead, he sank into the nearest chair and put his head in his hands. This was what losing felt like, real losing. Not a battle or a negotiation, but the complete collapse of everything that mattered. The evening passed in a blur. Adrian sat in his study, drinking whiskey that tasted like ash, while sounds of packing drifted from Vivian's rooms. Servants moved quietly through the manor, their faces carefully blank. Around midnight, Marcus appeared at the door. Your Grace, he began carefully, if I might suggest, don't. I just think that perhaps... I said don't. Marcus retreated, and Adrian was alone again with his thoughts and the growing certainty that he'd destroyed the only good thing that had entered his life in a decade. Sleep was impossible. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to Vivian moving around in the adjacent room, and wondering how he'd become the kind of man his wife had to escape from. His father had been many things: ruthless, strategic, capable of extraordinary cruelty in service of the duchy. But he'd never been weak, never allowed emotions to compromise his judgment. And here was Adrian, brought to his knees by 3 weeks of marriage to a woman who made him feel things he'd spent his entire life avoiding. Dawn came too fast and too bright. Adrian dressed mechanically, then positioned himself near the main entrance because he needed to see her leave. Needed the visual confirmation of his failure. Vivian appeared at 7, dressed for travel, her expression empty of everything except exhausted determination. A carriage waited in the courtyard, servants loading her trunks with practiced efficiency. She walked toward the door without looking at him. How long? He asked. She paused. I don't know. Will you write? If I have something to say. Vivian, please don't. Don't make this harder than it already is. She moved toward the door again, and Adrian felt something inside him crack completely open. I love you. The words came out raw and desperate, and Vivian's hand tightened on her travel bag. Don't, she said without turning around. It's true, I know. That's what makes this so sad. She walked out, and Adrian watched through the window as she climbed into the carriage. Watched as it pulled away down the long drive. Watched until it disappeared beyond the gates, and there was nothing left to see. Then he destroyed his study. Every book went flying, every paper scattered. The whiskey decanter shattered against the far wall, expensive liquor soaking into expensive carpet. He overturned the desk with strength fueled by rage and grief and self-loathing. When there was nothing left to break, he stood in the wreckage, breathing hard and feeling absolutely nothing except the cold certainty that he'd lost the only battle that mattered. Marcus appeared in the doorway, took one look at the destruction, and quietly closed the door again. Adrian sank to the floor among the debris and tried to remember who he'd been before Vivian. The cold, controlled duke who never felt anything he couldn't use, who treated people like chess pieces and emotions like liabilities. That man seemed like a stranger now, someone from another life who'd been stupidly, tragically convinced that not feeling anything made him strong. The days that followed were mechanical. Adrian attended meetings, signed documents, made decisions about border defenses and trade negotiations. He functioned perfectly well on the surface, while something fundamental rotted underneath. The gossip exploded, of course. The Duchess of Blackwell fleeing to her family estate less than a month into marriage. The cold Duke, finally revealed as the monster everyone had always suspected. Lady Ashford, vindicated in her assessment that the marriage was a disaster. Adrian endured it with the same blank expression he brought to everything. What did gossip matter when the person whose opinion actually counted had already judged him and found him wanting? On the 5th day, Crown Prince Cedric showed up unannounced. "You look terrible," the prince said, settling into a chair in Adrian's study without invitation. "Thank you for the observation. When was the last time you slept?" "I don't remember." 8. Does whiskey count as food? Cedric sighed. So you're going to sit here drowning in self-pity until she either comes back or files for annulment. That's your strategy. I don't have a strategy. Clearly. Which is why I'm here. Because watching the Empire's most brilliant strategic mind collapse over a woman is both tragic and embarrassing. Adrian looked at him with dead eyes. What do you want, Cedric? I want you to fix this, or at least try to fix it. How? She's gone. She made it very clear that my presence in her life is destructive. So stop being destructive. Revolutionary advice. I'm serious. The prince leaned forward. You're treating this like a military defeat, something that happened to you. But Adrian, you did this. Your jealousy, your control, your complete inability to trust the woman you claim to love. You created this situation, which means you're the only one who can fix it. By doing what exactly? By becoming someone different. By actually changing instead of just promising to change and then reverting to the same possessive behavior the moment you feel threatened. Adrian laughed bitterly. You're asking me to fundamentally alter my personality. I'm asking you to grow up. To stop treating your emotions like they're some external force you have no control over. You're not a child, Blackwell. You're a grown man who spent decades mastering self-discipline in every area except the one that matters. It's exactly true. You can negotiate treaties without blinking. You can make life or death military decisions with perfect clarity. But put you in a room with your wife and another man, and you lose your mind. That's not love. That's cowardice. The accusation landed like a slap. Cowardice. Yes. You're terrified of losing her, so instead of building something real, you try to lock her down, control her movements, eliminate any threat. And when that doesn't work because, surprise, people can't be controlled like military assets, you're shocked that she leaves. Adrian wanted to argue, wanted to defend his actions as protective rather than possessive. But the words died in his throat because Cedric was right. Every jealous outburst, every intervention, every moment of trying to shield Vivian from other men had been driven by fear. Not love, not trust. Just raw, naked terror of losing something precious. And that fear had created the exact outcome he'd been trying to prevent. So what do I do? He asked quietly. Cedric stood. You figure out who you actually want to be. Not the cold duke your father raised you to be. Not the jealous husband you've become. Someone new. Someone who can love Vivian without trying to own her. And if I can't, then you let her go. Completely. Give her the annulment she'll eventually ask for and spend the rest of your life alone. Because that's what happens to people who can't learn to trust. The prince left, and Adrian sat in his destroyed study considering the choice laid out in front of him. He could stay this person. The Duke of Blackwell who felt too much and controlled too little, who drove away the only woman who'd ever made him feel human, or he could become someone different, someone who deserved Vivian. The thought was terrifying, because becoming someone new meant letting go of every defense mechanism he'd built over 32 years. Meant accepting vulnerability as strength rather than weakness. Meant trusting that love didn't have to be controlled to be real. But the alternative was losing Vivian forever. And that was unacceptable. Adrian stood, surveyed the wreckage of his study, and made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. He was going to change. Actually change. Not the surface-level promises he'd been making, but fundamental transformation of everything he'd believed about power and control and what it meant to care about someone. And if that didn't work, if Vivian still chose to leave even after he'd become someone worthy of her, then at least he'd know he'd tried. The first step was admitting the scope of the problem. Adrian spent the next 3 days reviewing every interaction he'd had with Vivian since their wedding, every jealous outburst, every intervention, every moment where he'd chosen control over trust. The list was damning. He'd pulled her away from conversations at least a dozen times. He'd interrogated her about interactions with other men constantly. He'd made decisions about their social calendar without consulting her. He'd physically removed her from the hunting festival in front of half the imperial court, and through all of it, he'd told himself he was protecting her, being a good husband, honoring his vows. The self-deception was staggering. On the 4th day, he did something he'd never done before. He wrote Vivian a letter. Not a formal communication or a strategic message. An actual letter. Honest and raw and completely vulnerable. He told her about his childhood, about a father who'd viewed affection as weakness and raised him to be a weapon rather than a person, about learning to suppress every emotion that could be used against him until there was nothing left but cold calculation, about meeting her and feeling that carefully constructed wall crack open, about the terror of wanting something he couldn't control, about how that terror had manifested as jealousy and possession and every toxic behavior she'd accused him of. And he apologized, actually apologized without qualification or excuse, for every intervention, for every moment where he treated her like property rather than partner, for being so consumed by fear that he'd destroyed the relationship he'd been trying to protect. He ended with a promise. Not that he'd change because he already knew promises meant nothing without action, but that he was in the process of changing, that regardless of whether she came back, he was becoming someone different, someone who could love without destroying, someone who deserved her. He sent the letter and waited. Days passed with no response. Adrian threw himself into work with manic intensity. The Valorian border situation was escalating, and coordinating the imperial military response required constant attention. He attended war councils, reviewed troop deployments, made decisions about strategy and logistics that would determine the outcome of a potential conflict. At night, he sat alone in his study reading books about trust and vulnerability and healthy relationships. The irony wasn't lost on him. The Duke of Blackwell studying emotional intelligence like it was a military manual. 2 weeks after Vivian left, Lady Markham requested an audience. She swept into his study with the kind of confidence that came from decades of navigating court politics and outliving 3 husbands. "Your Grace," she said, settling into a chair without invitation, "we need to discuss your wife." Adrian set down the report he'd been reading. "I wasn't aware the Duchess was any of your concern. Everything that happens at court is my concern. And right now, what's happening is that your marriage is becoming a spectacle that reflects poorly on everyone involved. I'm aware of the gossip. Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, you seem content to let malicious rumors destroy your wife's reputation while you hide in your study, pretending to work. I sent her a letter. 1 letter. In 2 weeks. She's being eviscerated by women like Ashford who see vulnerability as opportunity, and you sent 1 letter. What exactly would you have me do? Fight for her." Lady Markham's eyes were sharp. "Not the way you've been fighting, with jealousy and possession, but actually fight. Defend her reputation. Make it clear that the gossip is baseless and anyone spreading it will answer to you. She left me because you gave her no choice. But that doesn't mean you abandon her to the wolves." Adrian leaned back in his chair. "You're very direct. I'm old. I don't have time for diplomacy." She softened slightly. "Vivian is a remarkable young woman, intelligent, strategic, capable of being one of the most influential duchesses this empire has ever seen. But she can't do that if her reputation is destroyed by vicious gossip, while her husband sits here feeling sorry for himself." The accusation stung because it was accurate. He'd been so consumed by his own guilt and grief that he hadn't considered how Vivian's absence would be interpreted. Hadn't thought about the narratives being constructed in drawing rooms and salons across the capital. "What do you suggest? Make a statement, public and unambiguous, that the Duchess is visiting family as planned, that your marriage is solid, that anyone spreading rumors about infidelity will find themselves on the wrong side of the Duke of Blackwell. That will just fuel more speculation. Perhaps. But it will also put people on notice that you're not going to let them destroy your wife without consequences." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "And Adrian, when she does come back, and she will come back because I've known that girl since she was 15, and she doesn't run from fights she intends to lose, you need to be someone worth coming back to." After she left, Adrian sat staring at nothing and realizing that his self-imposed isolation had been another form of cowardice. He'd been so focused on his own pain that he'd failed to protect Vivian from the predictable consequences of their separation. That ended now. He summoned Marcus and spent the next hour drafting a formal statement to be distributed to every major household in the capital. The Duchess was visiting her family. Their marriage was strong. Rumors to the contrary were baseless and would be treated as personal insults to the Blackwell name. Then he attended every public event on his calendar for the next week and made his presence felt. When Lady Ashford tried to approach at the opera, he cut her so thoroughly that she left in tears. When Count Aldrich made a veiled comment about wayward wives, Adrian suggested they discuss it privately in a tone that made the Count go pale. The gossip didn't stop, but it changed. shifted from gleeful speculation about the Duchess's infidelity to nervous whispers about the Duke's wrath. It wasn't enough, but it was something. 3 weeks after Vivian left, a letter arrived. Adrian recognized her handwriting immediately and had to physically restrain himself from tearing it open like a desperate teenager. Instead, he sat at his desk, poured a glass of water because his hands were shaking too badly for whiskey, and carefully broke the seal. The letter was short. Vivian's words were precise and careful, giving away nothing except what she chose to reveal. She'd received his letter. She appreciated his honesty. She was glad he was working on himself because regardless of what happened between them, he deserved to be someone he could live with. But she wasn't ready to come back yet. She needed more time, more distance, more proof that the changes he claimed to be making were real and lasting. She ended with a single line that hit harder than anything else she could have written. "Love isn't enough, Adrian. Trust is what makes love survive." He read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in his desk drawer. Beside it, he put his own letter to her, the one he'd agonized over for hours. They weren't enough. Words on paper couldn't rebuild what he'd destroyed, but they were a start, and starting was all he could do. The Imperial Winter Ball was 6 weeks away, and Adrian had no idea Vivian would attend. Her family's estate was far enough that she could reasonably decline on grounds of distance. But the ball was the social event of the season, and missing it would fuel exactly the kind of speculation he'd been working to suppress. He sent a formal invitation through official channels. Not a personal plea, not another letter begging her to come back, just the standard notification that the Duke and Duchess of Blackwell were expected to attend. Her response came 3 days later, equally formal. The Duchess would be honored to attend. Adrian read those words and felt something like hope crack open in his chest, because she was coming back. Maybe not permanently, maybe just for the ball, but she was coming. And he had 6 weeks to prove he'd become someone worthy of her trust. The work was harder than any military campaign he'd ever coordinated, harder than negotiating treaties or managing political crises, because it required looking at himself with brutal honesty and accepting that most of what he saw was ugly. He met with a scholar who specialized in philosophy and human behavior. The man was ancient, half-blind, and had a reputation for telling nobility exactly what they didn't want to hear. "You want me to fix you," the scholar said during their first meeting. "Make you into someone your wife can love. No, I want to fix myself. Whether she loves me is her choice." The scholar smiled. "Good answer. Most men your age are still convinced they can control how other people feel about them." They spent hours discussing the root of Adrian's control issues. The childhood trauma of losing his mother young. The father who'd viewed emotions as weapons to be suppressed. The years of military service where control meant survival and vulnerability meant death. Understanding didn't excuse the behavior, but it helped Adrian identify the patterns. The triggers that made him default to possession rather than partnership. The fear responses he'd been misidentifying as protective instincts. Slowly, painfully, he started to change. He practiced having conversations where he listened without trying to direct the outcome. He attended social events and didn't track who was talking to whom. He made decisions about the duchy and then genuinely consulted his advisors about implementation rather than just issuing orders. It felt wrong, like wearing clothes that didn't fit. Every instinct screamed at him to take control, to direct, to manage. He ignored those instincts and kept trying. 5 weeks after Vivian left, word came from the northern border. Valorian forces had crossed into Imperial territory. The war everyone had been anticipating was here. Adrian threw himself into coordinating the military response with the kind of focused intensity that had made him legendary. He worked 20-hour days reviewing intelligence, planning counteroffensives, managing supply chains. But even in the middle of a military crisis, he found himself thinking about Vivian, wondering if she'd heard about the invasion, if she was worried, if she thought about him at all. The Winter Ball was now 2 weeks away, and Adrian had no idea if she'd still come with the war starting, had no idea if she'd want to be anywhere near him when the empire was fracturing. Then a message arrived from her family's estate. "I'm coming to the ball. We need to talk." Adrian read those 5 words and understood that everything he'd been working toward was about to be tested, because Vivian was coming back. And whatever happened at that ball would determine whether they had a future or whether the coldest man in the empire had finally learned how to love just in time to lose everything that mattered. The Imperial Winter Ball was 48 hours away when the war reports from the northern border went from concerning to catastrophic. Valorian forces had broken through the mountain passes with numbers that suggested this wasn't a skirmish, but a full-scale invasion. 3 regiments were pinned down. Supply lines were compromised. And the commander of the Northern Theater was requesting immediate reinforcement or authorization to retreat. Adrian stood in the war room surrounded by maps and exhausted generals, making calculations that would determine whether soldiers lived or died. The part of him that had been trained since childhood to treat people like chess pieces was fully operational, cold, precise, ruthlessly efficient. But underneath that, in the place where Vivian had torn open something he couldn't close, he felt every single life hanging in the balance like a weight against his chest. "We need to commit the 5th and 7th Legions," General Rothschild was saying. "It's the only way to prevent a complete collapse of the defensive line." "That leaves the eastern border vulnerable," Adrian said. "If Valorian coordinated this with the Kelderan Alliance, then we're fighting a war on 2 fronts. I'm aware. But if we lose the north, we lose the iron supply. Without iron, we lose the ability to maintain any front." The logic was sound. The decision was obvious. But committing those legions meant pulling them from positions where they were all that stood between imperial citizens and foreign occupation. There were no good choices, only varying degrees of catastrophic. "Do it," Adrian said. "Full deployment, authorization code Blackwell 7 Alpha." The room erupted into coordinated chaos as orders were relayed and logistics coordinated. Adrian watched it all with the same detachment he'd cultivated over years of command, and wondered if Vivian would even recognize the man he became in this environment. Wondered if he recognized himself anymore. "Your Grace," Marcus appeared at his elbow, looking apologetic. "The Duchess has arrived." Adrian's concentration shattered completely. "What? She arrived an hour ago. She's at Blackwell Manor. I was told to inform you when there was a break in the briefing." "There's a war happening. I'm aware. I'm simply relaying the message." Adrian looked at the maps covered in troop positions and supply routes, looked at the generals waiting for additional orders, looked at the entire military apparatus that depended on his strategic mind functioning at peak efficiency. Then he looked at Marcus and said, "I need 20 minutes. Your Grace, the situation. 20 minutes. If the Valorian forces advance past checkpoint Theta, send word immediately. Otherwise, General Rothschild has command authority." He left before anyone could object, striding through palace corridors with singular focus. The carriage ride back to Blackwell Manor took 15 minutes that felt like hours. She was in the drawing room, standing near the window in a traveling dress the color of winter sky, her hair pulled back in a simple style that made her look younger and impossibly beautiful. She turned when he entered, and her expression was carefully neutral. Adrian, Vivian. They stood 10 feet apart, and the distance felt like a chasm. "I got your message," he said, "about needing to talk." "Yes." She folded her hands in front of her, the gesture betraying her nerves. "I thought we should discuss expectations for the ball, how we're going to present ourselves publicly." "Of course, because that's what mattered. Appearances, strategy, the careful performance they'd both been trained to execute." "I don't care about the ball," Adrian said. Her eyebrows rose. "You don't care about the single most important social event of the season, about what the entire court will think when they see us together for the first time in 6 weeks. No, I care about whether you're here because you want to be or because you feel obligated." Vivian's careful composure cracked slightly. "I don't know how to answer that. Try honesty." "All right. Honesty." She took a breath. "I'm here because I read your letter 17 times. Because Lady Markham wrote me and said you've been defending my reputation like your life depends on it. Because every piece of gossip that reaches the estate suggests you're actually changing instead of just promising to change. But I don't know if it's real, if it's permanent. Or if the moment I come back fully, you'll revert to the same jealous, possessive behavior that made me leave in the first place." Adrian crossed half the distance between them, then stopped. "Fair enough. That's it. Just fair enough. What do you want me to say? That I can guarantee I'll never feel jealous again? I can't. That I've completely eliminated every possessive instinct? I haven't. But I can tell you that I've spent 6 weeks learning to recognize those impulses before I act on them, learning to choose trust over control even when every fiber of my being screams otherwise. And what happens at the ball? When you see me dancing with Crown Prince Cedric, or talking to Lord Pemberton, or any of the 100 other men who will be there, then I'll feel jealous, and angry, and terrified, and I'll stand there feeling all of it without doing a damn thing to stop you. Because you're right, love isn't enough. Trust is what makes love survive. And I'm choosing to trust you even though it's the hardest thing I've ever done. Vivian's eyes were bright with tears she refused to let fall. You're asking me to believe you fundamentally changed in 6 weeks. No, I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove it. Before she could respond, Marcus burst through the door without knocking. Your Grace, General Rothschild sent word. Checkpoint Theta has fallen. Valorian forces are advancing toward the civilian settlements. Adrian's entire body went cold. Casualties. Unknown. But the 5th Legion is requesting permission to engage in urban terrain, which means they're planning to fight in populated areas where civilians will be caught in the crossfire. Marcus nodded grimly. Adrian looked at Vivian, who'd gone pale, then back at Marcus. Tell the general I'm returning immediately, and send word to the Emperor that I'm requesting authorization for Operation Scorched Ground. Vivian's breath caught. That's the complete evacuation protocol. It's the only way to save civilian lives before the fighting reaches them. You'll need Imperial approval. That could take hours. Then I'll spend hours getting it. He turned back to Marcus. Move. The secretary fled, and Adrian was already heading for the door when Vivian's voice stopped him. I'm coming with you. What? To the War Council. I'm coming. Vivian, this is your wife offering to help. You said you wanted partnership instead of possession. Prove it. Adrian stared at her, and for 3 seconds he felt every old instinct screaming at him to refuse, to protect her from the brutal reality of military command, to keep her safe and separate from the ugliness of war. Then he made a choice that felt like ripping out his own spine. All right. But if you're coming, you're actually contributing. This is an observation. I wouldn't have offered otherwise. They rode back to the palace together in silence, but it was different than the careful distance they'd maintained for weeks. This was the silence of 2 people preparing for battle. The war room was chaos when they arrived, reports flooding in from multiple fronts, Valorian forces pushing deeper into Imperial territory, civilian populations fleeing toward the capital with enemy troops in pursuit. General Rothschild looked up when Adrian entered with Vivian beside him, surprise flickering across his face. Duchess Blackwell will be observing, Adrian said, his tone making it clear that objections weren't welcome. Then he threw himself into the strategic problem with the same focused intensity he brought to everything. Evacuation routes were plotted. Military assets were repositioned. Civilian shelters were designated in fortified locations. Vivian stood near the main map table, taking it all in with sharp attention. When one of the junior officers suggested a route that would funnel evacuees through a narrow pass, she spoke up. That pass floods during winter storms. If weather turns, you'll have 3,000 civilians trapped with no alternate route. The room went silent. The officer looked embarrassed. She's right, Adrian said. Mark that route as contingency only. Primary evacuation goes through the southern valley. The work continued for hours. Plans were made and revised and made again as new information arrived. Adrian coordinated it all with the mechanical precision that had made him legendary, and Vivian contributed observations that proved she'd been paying attention to geography and logistics all along. At some point, Crown Prince Cedric arrived to observe on behalf of the Emperor. Your Grace, he said to Adrian, then turned to Vivian with a slight bow. Duchess, I wasn't aware you'd returned. Just today, Vivian replied. I thought my presence might be useful. Cedric's gaze moved between them, reading dynamics with the same skill he brought to political negotiations. How very domestic, the Duke and Duchess working together to save the Empire. Someone has to, Adrian said without looking up from the map. Your father is still deliberating on evacuation authorization. He's concerned about the precedent. Ordering full civilian evacuations could be interpreted as weakness. Interpretation doesn't matter when people are dying. A valid point. Cedric studied the troop positions. What's your assessment of Valorian capabilities? They're better equipped and better coordinated than our intelligence suggested. Either someone's been feeding them information, or we've drastically underestimated their military development. Or both. Or both. The prince was quiet for a moment. I'll speak to my father about the evacuation authorization. You're right that civilian casualties are unacceptable. Thank you. After Cedric left, Vivian moved closer to where Adrian was reviewing supply manifests. You trust him, she said quietly. The prince. As much as I trust anyone in the imperial family. Why? Just observing. You trust his judgment, but not his motives. Everyone has motives. The question is whether they align with yours often enough to be useful. She smiled slightly. That's very cynical. That's very accurate. A messenger arrived with new casualty reports. Adrian read them with the same blank expression he maintained for all bad news, then passed them to General Rothschild. We need to accelerate the timeline, he said. If these numbers are accurate, we have less than 48 hours before Valorian forces reach the primary civilian centers. The Emperor hasn't authorized evacuation yet. Then we prepare to execute the moment authorization comes through. I'm not waiting for bureaucratic approval while people die. Rothschild nodded and began issuing orders. Adrian felt Vivian watching him, felt the weight of her assessment. This was who he was in crisis. Cold, ruthless, willing to bypass authority and protocol when lives were at stake. He had no idea if she found that admirable or terrifying. The work continued through the night. At some point, servants brought food that nobody ate and coffee that everyone drank like medicine. Officers rotated in and out as exhaustion took its toll, but Adrian stayed, coordinating the entire operation with relentless focus. Vivian stayed too, making notes, asking questions, offering observations that proved increasingly valuable as her understanding of the situation deepened. Around 3 a.m, they found themselves alone near the map table while others were coordinating in adjacent rooms. You're good at this, Vivian said quietly. At what? Command. Crisis management. Making impossible decisions without flinching. I've had a lot of practice. She touched his arm, and the contact sent electricity through his exhausted nervous system. You've barely slept in days. Neither have you. I slept on the carriage ride from the estate. You've been here since yesterday morning. I'll sleep when the crisis is resolved. Adrian. Her hand tightened. You're no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion. I'm fine. You're swaying on your feet. He realized she was right. The room had started tilting slightly at the edges, and his hands had developed a tremor he'd been ignoring. 20 minutes, Vivian said firmly. There's a restroom down the hall. 20 minutes of actual sleep and you'll function better. I can't. You can. General Rothschild is competent. I'm here to monitor for any critical developments. 20 minutes won't collapse the war effort. Adrian wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he was fine, that he'd survived on less sleep during actual combat campaigns. But Vivian was looking at him with genuine concern, and the part of him that had spent 6 weeks learning to accept help instead of always being in control made the decision. 20 minutes, he agreed. The restroom was small and dark and blessedly quiet. Adrian collapsed onto the narrow cot and was asleep before he could think about it. He woke to Vivian shaking his shoulder with controlled urgency. Adrian, you need to wake up now. He was on his feet before conscious thought engaged, military training overriding exhaustion. What happened? The Emperor authorized the evacuation. But there's a complication. What kind of complication? Her face was grim. Crown Prince Cedric convinced his father to approve Operation Scorched Ground, but he also convinced him that the Duke of Blackwell should lead the military response personally. Adrian's mind raced through implications. Leading the response meant going to the northern border, meant being in actual combat zones while coordinating defensive operations. When? You're expected to depart at first light, which is in 3 hours, and the winter ball. Is tomorrow night? Vivian's voice was carefully controlled. So you'll be at the front lines while the entire imperial court gathers to judge our marriage. Adrian felt something that might have been bitter laughter building in his chest. Of course, because nothing about their relationship had ever been simple or well-timed. I'll send regrets, he said. Explain that military obligations. No. What? You're not missing the ball. Vivian stepped closer, and there was steel in her eyes. We've spent 6 weeks apart while gossip shredded my reputation, and everyone speculated about our marriage. You've spent that time changing, and I've spent it deciding whether to trust that change. We're not throwing all of that away because of poor timing. Vivian, there's a war happening. I'm aware. And you're going to win it. Then you're going to come back for the ball, and we're going to show the entire empire what partnership actually looks like. That's insane. The northern border is 3 days hard ride from the capital. Even if everything goes perfectly, I'd have maybe 6 hours before the ball starts. Then you'd better not waste time. Adrian stared at her and realized with perfect clarity that this was a test. Not a deliberate one, but a test nonetheless. Whether he could execute an impossible military operation and still show up for her. Whether he could balance duty and love without sacrificing either. Whether he'd learned anything at all in 6 weeks of trying to become someone different. All right, he said. I'll be there. Promise. I promise. She kissed him then. Fast and fierce and completely unexpected. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. Don't die, she said. Because I didn't spend 6 weeks deciding to give you another chance just to become a widow. I'll do my best. Your best had better be extraordinary. The next 3 hours were organized chaos. Adrian assembled his command staff, coordinated with General Rothschild on operational authority during his absence, and prepared for the fastest deployment in imperial military history. Vivian stayed with him through all of it, asking questions that suggested she was memorizing every detail in case something went wrong. As dawn broke, Adrian stood in the courtyard surrounded by 200 mounted soldiers and enough supplies for a week-long campaign. His armor was functional rather than decorative, his weapons were recently sharpened, and his mind was already calculating routes and tactics. Vivian appeared at his side, wrapped in a fur cloak against the morning cold. 3 days to reach the border, she said. 1 day to execute the operation. 3 days back. That's 7 days for a journey that normally takes 10. We'll make it work, and if you don't, then I die trying. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. That's not reassuring. It's honest. Vivian was quiet for a moment, then said, When you get back, when this is over and you're standing in that ballroom, I need you to ask me to dance. Just dance. Just dance. No grand gestures, no public declarations. Just you asking me to dance like I'm someone you want to be near rather than someone you're trying to possess. Adrian felt something shift in his chest. All right, promise me. I promise. He took her hand, the gesture feeling both familiar and foreign. Vivian, if I don't make it back, you will. But if I don't, I need you to know that these 6 weeks have been the most important of my life. Not because I learned to control jealousy or because I became someone better, but because for the first time I understood what it means to actually love someone instead of just wanting to own them. Her grip tightened. Then come back and prove it. The ride north was brutal. Adrian pushed his forces at a pace that had men falling asleep in their saddles, stopping only for the minimum rest required to keep horses functional. They covered in 2 days what normally took 4, arriving at the northern command post exhausted and ready for war. The situation was worse than reports had suggested. Valorian forces had entrenched in positions that would require frontal assault to dislodge, and civilian populations were scattered across terrain that made evacuation logistics a nightmare. Adrian spent 6 hours reviewing intelligence and coordinating with local commanders. Then he made a decision that would either save thousands of lives or get him killed. Instead of the conventional assault everyone expected, he split his forces. 2/3 would engage in a feint attack on the primary Valorian position. The remaining third, led by Adrian personally, would circle through mountain passes thought to be impassable and strike the enemy supply lines from behind. It was tactically brilliant and logistically insane. The mountain terrain was treacherous even in good weather, and winter storms made it potentially suicidal. But it was also the only way to force a Valorian withdrawal fast enough to execute the civilian evacuation. They moved at night, 70 soldiers following Adrian through narrow passes where one wrong step meant falling hundreds of feet. The cold was brutal. The darkness was absolute. And Adrian led them forward with the same grim determination he brought to everything, calculating odds and acceptable losses while trying not to think about Vivian waiting in the capital. They reached the Valorian supply depot 2 hours before dawn. The enemy had positioned minimal guards, assuming the terrain made approach impossible. They were wrong. Adrian's forces struck with coordinated precision. Fire arrows ignited supply wagons. Soldiers engaged guards in close-quarters combat. Within 20 minutes, the entire depot was in flames and Valorian forces were scrambling to respond. Then Adrian ordered the retreat. They fought their way back through the same impossible terrain they'd crossed to get there, except now they were moving in daylight while enemy forces pursued. Adrian's shoulder took a blade meant for his neck. His horse went down on a particularly treacherous slope, and he finished the journey on foot. But they made it, all 70 soldiers, battered and bleeding but alive. The Valorian forces, cut off from supplies and under assault from two directions, began withdrawing within hours. Adrian coordinated the civilian evacuation personally, riding through settlements and pulling people from their homes with the same ruthless efficiency he'd used to plan the attack. 3,000 civilians were relocated to protected areas before enemy forces could reach them. 0 casualties among the evacuees. 43 casualties among Imperial forces. Acceptable losses according to military doctrine. Adrian stared at the names of the dead and thought about how doctrine was written by people who'd never had to write letters to grieving families. The return journey to the capital was even faster than the northern deployment. Adrian rode with single-minded focus, barely stopping for food or sleep, driven by the promise he'd made and the image of Vivian in a ballroom waiting to see if he'd keep it. They reached the capital 40 minutes before the winter ball was scheduled to begin. Adrian went directly to Blackwell Manor, moving through familiar halls while servants scattered in his wake. His armor was damaged, his clothes were filthy. Blood had dried in his hair from the shoulder wound he'd barely noticed. Marcus met him at the entrance to his quarters looking horrified. "Your Grace, the ball." "I know." He started stripping off ruined clothes. "Get me presentable in 30 minutes. "That's impossible." "Then achieve the impossible. That's what we do in this family." Marcus summoned what seemed like an army of servants. Adrian was cleaned, bandaged, dressed in formal attire, and pronounced acceptable in exactly 28 minutes. He looked in the mirror and barely recognized himself. The cold Duke of Blackwell, famous for never showing emotion, looked exhausted and raw and completely undone. Good enough. The Imperial Winter Ball was already in full swing when Adrian arrived. He stood at the entrance to the grand ballroom, taking in the spectacle of 1,000 candles and 500 nobles dressed in their finest, and felt completely disconnected from all of it. Then he saw Vivian. She stood near the center of the room in a gown the color of midnight, surrounded by admirers but clearly waiting. When their eyes met across the crowded space, her expression shifted from careful composure to something that looked like relief. Adrian started toward her. The crowd parted without him asking, people stepping aside as they recognized the Duke of Blackwell fresh from battle, still moving with the controlled violence of someone who'd been in combat 36 hours ago. He reached Vivian and the entire ballroom went silent. "Duchess," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "May I have this dance?" Vivian looked at him with eyes that saw everything. The exhaustion, the bandaged shoulder barely hidden by formal clothes, the desperate hope that he'd kept his promise. "Yes," she said simply. He took her hand and led her onto the dance floor, while 500 nobles watched and whispered. The orchestra, reading the moment perfectly, began a waltz. Adrian pulled Vivian into the traditional hold, and they began to move. "You came back," she said quietly. "I promised I would." "You're wounded." "It's nothing." "Adrian." "All right, it's something, but I'm here, and I'm asking you to dance. Just dance. No grand gestures, no public declarations, just me wanting to be near you." Her eyes were bright with tears. "You remembered, every word." They moved together in silence for several measures, and Adrian became aware that he'd never actually danced with his wife before. Not at their wedding, not at any of the events they'd attended together. He'd been too consumed by jealousy and control to simply enjoy being near her. What a waste. The song continued, and gradually the rest of the ballroom resumed dancing, conversations picking up as the immediate spectacle faded into background noise. "The Northern campaign was successful," Vivian said. "How did you know?" "Because you're here. If it had failed, you'd still be there trying to fix it. Fair assessment. And because Crown Prince Cedric received word this morning that Valorian forces are withdrawing. Apparently they lost their primary supply depot in an attack everyone thought was impossible." Adrian smiled slightly. Sometimes impossible is just another word for no one's tried it yet. Vivian's expression softened. "You could have died." "Yes, Was it worth it? 3,000 civilians are alive because of that operation. So yes, she studied his face. You've changed, have I? The man I married 6 weeks ago would have stayed safely in the capital and sent someone else to lead that mission. Would have chosen political image over personal risk. Maybe. Or maybe I've always been this person and I just forgot because I was too busy trying to be what my father trained me to be. And what did he train you to be? Untouchable, invulnerable, incapable of caring about anything except duty and power. Vivian leaned closer, her voice dropping to something only he could hear. You're not that person anymore. No, I'm not. What are you now? Adrian looked at her, really looked at her, and felt every defense he'd spent 32 years building just dissolve. I'm someone terrified that the most important person in his life might not stay. I'm someone who spent 6 weeks learning that control is just fear-wearing armor. I'm someone who led 70 soldiers through impossible terrain because I made a promise to be here. And I'm someone who loves you so completely that it makes everything else in my life feel like background noise. The music swelled around them. Other couples danced past. The imperial court watched and whispered and judged. Adrian didn't care about any of it. I'm staying, Vivian said quietly. What? I'm staying. I'm coming back. Not because you've proven anything or because I've decided to trust you, but because I want to see who we become when we stop fighting each other and start fighting together. Adrian's next breath felt like it might crack his ribs. Before he could respond, Crown Prince Cedric appeared at the edge of the dance floor, his expression urgent. Your Grace, I apologize for the interruption, but there's a situation that requires your immediate attention. Adrian looked at Vivian, who nodded slightly. He released her with reluctance and followed Cedric to a private antechamber off the main ballroom. General Rothschild was already there, along with several other military advisors. What happened? Adrian demanded. Rothschild's face was grim. Valorian forces are withdrawing from the northern border as expected, but we've received intelligence that the Keldaran alliance is mobilizing along the eastern front. This wasn't just a Valorian incursion, it was coordinated. How coordinated? The general spread a map on the table. They're planning a pincer movement. Valorian from the north to draw our forces, Keldaran from the east to strike while we're committed elsewhere. When? Best estimate, 72 hours. Adrian stared at the map, his exhausted mind already calculating troop movements and defensive positions. This wasn't a border skirmish. This was the beginning of a war that could consume the entire empire. We need to recall the 5th and 7th legions, he said. Reposition them to defend the eastern approach before Keldaran forces can establish staging areas. That leaves the north vulnerable, Cedric said. The north is already secured. Valorian withdrew because we destroyed their supply infrastructure. They're not coming back without months of preparation. But Keldaran is fresh, supplied, and positioned to do catastrophic damage if we don't respond immediately. The room erupted into strategic discussion. Orders were drafted, deployments were planned, and Adrian coordinated all of it with the same focused intensity he'd brought to the northern campaign, even though every fiber of his being was screaming that he should be in the ballroom with his wife. 2 hours later, the immediate crisis was managed. Not solved, but contained enough that actual military commanders could handle execution. Adrian walked back into the ballroom. Vivian was exactly where he'd left her, standing alone near the dance floor, watching the entrance. He crossed to her, took her hand, and said, "We need to leave." She didn't ask questions, just nodded and walked with him toward the exit. The whispers started immediately. The Duke and Duchess of Blackwell, leaving the ball early together. Speculation about what that meant, what might be happening. Adrian didn't care. They rode back to Blackwell Manor in silence, but Vivian's hand was in his, and that felt like the only thing in the world that mattered. Inside their home, finally alone, Adrian turned to face his wife. "There's going to be a war," he said. "A real one. Not a border skirmish, but actual sustained conflict that could last months or years. And I'm going to be at the center of it because that's what the Empire requires." "I know. Which means I might not come back. I might die in some campaign trying to protect borders and people who don't even know my name. And I need you to understand that before we go any further." Vivian stepped closer. "I understand. Do you? Because you're talking about staying. about giving us another chance, but that chance might be 6 months or 6 weeks, depending on how quickly this war escalates. Then we'd better make every day count. Adrian felt something inside him break open completely. Not painfully, more like a door he'd kept locked his entire life finally swinging wide. "I don't deserve you," he said. "Probably not." Vivian's smile was sad and beautiful. "But we're past deserving. We're into choosing. And I'm choosing you, the real you. Not the cold duke everyone fears, not the jealous husband who made me leave, but the man who led 70 soldiers through impossible terrain because he made a promise. The man who's terrified and exhausted and still standing here being honest about it." "I love you," Adrian said. And this time it didn't feel like weakness or vulnerability. It felt like the strongest thing he'd ever said. "I know." Vivian reached up and touched his face. "I love you too, which is why we're going to figure this out, together." They stood together in the entrance hall of Blackwell Manor while war gathered on the Empire's borders, and the future remained horrifyingly uncertain. But for the first time since their wedding, Adrian felt something that wasn't fear or jealousy or desperate control. He felt hope. And hope, he was beginning to understand, was the most dangerous and necessary thing a person could carry into battle. Outside, church bells rang midnight. The winter ball continued without them. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the capital, enemy forces prepared for a conflict that would test everything the Empire had built. But inside Blackwell Manor, the coldest man in the Empire held his wife's hand and made one final promise. "Whatever happens in this war, whatever chaos comes, I'm done trying to control you. I'm done treating love like a military objective. From now on, we're partners, equals. And if that means I have to learn to trust you while enemy forces are literally marching on our borders, then that's what I'll do." Vivian's smile was fierce and proud. "Good. Because you're going to need a partner for what's coming. Not a possession, not someone to protect, but someone who fights beside you." Adrian pulled her close, feeling her heart beat against his chest, and understood with perfect clarity that this was what courage actually meant. Not the absence of fear, but choosing love anyway, even when the world was burning down around you, even when you had everything to lose. The war came faster than anyone anticipated. Within 72 hours of the winter ball, Keldaran forces crossed the eastern border in numbers that suggested months of preparation. The Empire mobilized with the grinding efficiency of a military machine built over centuries, and Adrian found himself at the center of strategic coordination that would determine whether the Empire survived or fractured. But something fundamental had shifted in how he approached command. Where before he'd treated soldiers as expendable assets in service of strategic objectives, now he saw them as people with families and futures that depended on his decisions. Where before he'd made choices with cold calculation, now he felt the weight of every life in his hands like stones pressing against his chest. Vivian noticed immediately. They were in his study reviewing deployment orders when she set down the document she'd been reading and looked at him with that expression that saw too much. "You're hesitating," she said. "I'm being thorough." "No. You're second-guessing yourself. That's new." Adrian leaned back in his chair, exhaustion making his bones ache. "Is that a problem?" "I don't know yet." Vivian moved around the desk to stand beside him. The old you would have signed those orders without blinking. Sent 3 regiments into a potentially catastrophic engagement because the strategic calculus said it was acceptable risk. And now you're thinking about the soldiers who won't come back, about the families who'll get letters explaining that their sons and husbands died for acceptable risk. She wasn't wrong. The deployment orders in front of him called for a flanking maneuver that would pressure Keldaran supply lines but expose Imperial forces to counterattack. The mathematics were sound. The strategy was solid, and the projected casualty rate was 15%. 15% of 3,000 soldiers meant 450 lives. Adrian stared at the numbers and tried to remember when he'd started counting bodies as people instead of statistics. "Sign the orders," Vivian said quietly. He looked up at her in surprise. "What?" "Sign them. The strategy is sound. The alternative is allowing Keldaran forces to establish fortified positions that will cost even more lives to dislodge later. You're not hesitating because the plan is wrong. You're hesitating because you're finally feeling the weight of command. And you think I should ignore that. No. I think you should carry it, feel every bit of it, Let it inform your decisions without paralyzing you. She placed her hand over his. That's what separates a good commander from a tyrant. Not the absence of feeling, but the ability to feel everything and still do what's necessary. Adrian looked at their hands, then back at the deployment orders. Then he signed them with handwriting that was steadier than he felt. The Eastern Campaign consumed the next 6 weeks. Adrian coordinated from the capital while General Rothschild commanded field operations. And the reports that came back were a mixture of victories and losses that painted no clear picture of who was actually winning. But through all of it, Vivian was there. Not as a decoration or a distraction, but as a genuine partner who understood strategy and logistics well enough to offer meaningful insights. She attended war councils, reviewed intelligence reports, challenged his assumptions when she thought he was being too conservative or too aggressive. And somehow, in the middle of coordinating a war that could destroy the empire, their marriage became real. It happened in small moments. Adrian returning from a 16-hour strategy session to find Vivian asleep at his desk, still wearing the clothes she'd put on that morning. The way she'd wake up and immediately start asking questions about troop movements before her eyes were fully open. The nights they'd both collapse into bed too exhausted for anything except lying beside each other, and how that proximity felt more intimate than any grand romantic gesture. The morning Adrian realized he'd stopped tracking who she talked to, stopped feeling that spike of jealousy when other men engaged her in conversation. Not because he'd suppressed the feeling, but because he genuinely trusted that her attention and affection were choices she made rather than things he needed to control. That realization hit him during a diplomatic reception where Lord Pemberton spent 20 minutes discussing trade policy with Vivian, while Adrian stood 15 feet away in conversation with the Minister of Finance. The old Adrian would have been calculating how to interrupt, would have been watching for signs of inappropriate interest or imagined betrayal. The new Adrian finished his conversation and then walked over to join them, contributing to the discussion rather than disrupting it. Pemberton looked surprised, then wary, then gradually relaxed as it became clear that Adrian's presence wasn't a territorial challenge, but genuine participation in policy discussion. After Pemberton excused himself, Vivian looked at Adrian with something like wonder. "What?" he asked. "You didn't threaten him, didn't glare, didn't pull me away or make some possessive comment. Should I have? The old you would have. The old me was an idiot." She laughed, and the sound was so genuine and unguarded that Adrian felt something in his chest expand. He'd made her laugh, not through wit or charm, but through actual change, through becoming someone different. "I'm proud of you," Vivian said quietly. Those 4 words meant more than any military commendation or imperial honor he'd ever received. The turning point in the Eastern Campaign came 8 weeks into the conflict. Keldaran forces had overextended their supply lines in pursuit of a quick victory, and Adrian saw an opportunity to cut them off completely. It would require committing nearly every available reserve unit and leaving the capital defended by minimal forces. But if it worked, the war would be over within weeks. If it failed, the empire would be vulnerable to invasion from multiple directions simultaneously. He presented the plan to the War Council and watched experienced generals argue both sides with equal passion. The risk was extraordinary. The potential reward was total victory. Crown Prince Cedric, attending as the Emperor's representative, listened to all arguments and then looked at Adrian. "Your recommendation, Your Grace." Adrian thought about acceptable losses and strategic objectives, thought about 450 lives being a reasonable price for tactical advantage, thought about all the cold calculations that had defined his approach to command for years. Then he thought about Vivian asking him who he wanted to be. "We execute the plan," he said, "but we do it with full transparency. Every soldier involved needs to understand the risks they're taking. This isn't a standard deployment. It's an all-or-nothing gamble with their lives as the stake. They deserve to know that before they commit." The room went silent. Commanders didn't typically explain strategic rationale to common soldiers. Orders were given and expected to be followed without question. "That's unconventional," General Rothschild said carefully. "It's honest. And if I'm asking 3,000 men to risk their lives on a strategy that could end in catastrophic failure, they deserve honesty." The plan was approved. The soldiers were briefed with complete transparency about risks and objectives. And when the order to deploy was given, not a single unit refused. They marched east with the kind of grim determination that came from understanding exactly what they were fighting for and why it mattered. Adrian watched them go and felt the weight of every single life pressing against his chest like physical mass. Vivian found him standing alone in the war room hours after the deployment, staring at maps that showed troop movements in real time. "They'll succeed," she said. "You don't know that." "No. But I know you wouldn't have committed them if you didn't believe it was possible. And I know that whatever happens, you made the right choice." "How can you be sure?" "Because you're not the man who would sacrifice soldiers for acceptable risk anymore. You're the man who gives them honesty and trusts them to choose. That's the kind of leadership that inspires extraordinary things." Adrian turned to face her fully. "And if I'm wrong, if this fails and thousands die because I gambled on a strategy that was too aggressive, then we deal with that together." Vivian stepped closer. "You don't carry this alone anymore, Adrian. That's what partnership means." He pulled her into his arms and held on like she was the only solid thing in a world that had become chaos and uncertainty. She held him back with equal intensity, and for several minutes they just stood there in the war room, surrounded by maps and reports, while the future hung in precarious balance. 3 days later, word came from the Eastern Front. The gamble had worked. Kelderan supply lines were severed. Their forces were withdrawing in disarray. And Imperial casualties were far lower than projected because soldiers who understood the stakes fought with precision born from genuine commitment rather than blind obedience. The war wasn't over, but the momentum had shifted decisively. Adrian read the report 3 times, then walked to the nearest window and stared out at the capital spread below him. Somewhere in those streets were families who would get their soldiers back alive. Somewhere were children who wouldn't grow up fatherless because a strategy had worked. He'd spent his entire adult life treating command as an exercise in cold calculation, and one decision to prioritize honesty over control had achieved better results than any manipulation or strategic brilliance. The lesson was both humbling and liberating. Vivian appeared beside him, reading over his shoulder. "You did it. We did it," she smiled. "Look at you, learning to share credit. What's next? Admitting when you're wrong. Don't push your luck." But there was no heat in the words, and Vivian laughed. The final peace negotiations with Kelderan took another month. Adrian participated as one of several imperial representatives, but Crown Prince Cedric led the actual diplomatic effort with skill that made Adrian grateful the prince was an ally rather than an adversary. The terms were favorable. Kelderan withdrew completely from occupied territories. Trade routes were re-established, reparations were negotiated, and both sides agreed to a non-aggression treaty that would hopefully prevent this kind of catastrophic conflict for at least a generation. When the treaty was finally signed, the entire capital celebrated with the kind of relief that came from survival against genuine existential threat. Adrian attended the formal celebration in the palace ballroom, but his attention kept drifting to Vivian. She was in conversation with a group that included Lady Markham, Countess Pellier, and several other influential noblewomen who'd initially been skeptical of her. Now they were listening to her observations about post-war reconstruction with the kind of attention reserved for genuine expertise. She'd become exactly what Lady Markham had predicted months ago. One of the most influential duchesses in the empire. Not through manipulation or social climbing, but through genuine intelligence and strategic insight that proved valuable in both war and peace. Adrian felt pride watching her, but it wasn't the possessive pride of ownership. It was the genuine admiration of seeing someone extraordinary operate at full capacity. Lord Pemberton appeared at his elbow with 2 glasses of wine. "Your Grace, you look contemplative, just observing. Your wife is quite remarkable." The young lord's tone was carefully neutral. "The Empire is fortunate to have someone with her capabilities in a position of influence." Adrian accepted the wine glass. "We are. And Pemberton, I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For treating you like a threat when you were just being kind to someone who needed kindness. For letting jealousy turn every friendly interaction into imagined betrayal. You didn't deserve that." Pemberton looked genuinely surprised. "That's very gracious, Your Grace. It's overdue." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the celebration, and Adrian realized this was what growth actually looked like. Not grand transformations or dramatic revelations, but small moments of choosing differently, of apologizing for past behavior and meaning it. The party continued late into the night, but eventually Adrian and Vivian made their excuses and returned to Blackwell Manor. The carriage ride was quiet, both of them exhausted from months of sustained crisis. Inside their home, Vivian kicked off her shoes with a sigh of relief and collapsed onto the drawing room sofa. "I'm getting too old for celebrations that last until 3 in the morning," she said. "You're 24. "Exactly. Ancient." Adrian sat beside her, and she immediately shifted to lean against him. The gesture was casual and intimate, the kind of unconscious proximity that came from genuine comfort rather than performance. "We should talk about what happens next," he said quietly. Vivian tilted her head to look up at him. "What do you mean?" "The war is over. The immediate crisis is resolved. Normal life resumes, which means we need to figure out what normal actually looks like for us." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you want it to look like?" Adrian considered the question with the kind of careful attention he'd once reserved for military strategy. "Honest answer. I want mornings where we have breakfast together and talk about something other than troop movements. I want evenings where we can just exist in the same space without crisis demanding our attention. I want to learn everything about you that I didn't bother learning when I was too consumed by jealousy to actually pay attention. That sounds nice, and I want to stop being afraid." "Of what?" "Of losing you. Of messing this up so badly that you leave again. Of reverting to the person I was before and destroying everything we've built." Vivian sat up fully, turning to face him. "Adrian, look at me." He met her eyes. "You're going to mess up sometimes," she said firmly. "You're going to feel jealous or possessive or have moments where old patterns try to reassert themselves. That's not failure. That's being human. What matters is what you do with those feelings, whether you let them control you or whether you acknowledge them and choose something different. And if I can't, if I have a moment where I completely revert, then we deal with it together. We talk about it. We work through it. But I need you to understand something." She took his hands in hers. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm not looking for an excuse to leave or waiting for you to fail. I'm here because I choose to be here, because I love the man you're becoming, and I want to be part of whatever comes next. Even if what comes next is boring domesticity after months of war and crisis. Especially if it's boring domesticity. I could use some boring." Adrian pulled her close and kissed her with the kind of desperate relief that came from finally believing he might actually deserve something good. When they broke apart, Vivian was smiling. "Take me to bed," she said, and not in some grand romantic gesture way, just in the "we're both exhausted and I want to fall asleep next to my husband" way. "That I can do." They went upstairs together, and for the first time in their marriage, it felt completely natural. No performance, no careful distance. Just two people who'd chosen each other navigating the ordinary intimacy of a shared life. The months that followed were not perfect. There were arguments and misunderstandings and moments where Adrian felt old patterns trying to reassert themselves. But each time, he chose differently. Chose conversation over control, chose trust over possession, chose partnership over dominance. And slowly, painfully, the cold Duke of Blackwell, who'd never wanted to feel anything, became someone capable of genuine vulnerability. It happened in accumulated moments. Adrian admitting when he was wrong about a policy decision. Vivian calling him out when he started to default to authoritarian behavior. Both of them learning to apologize without qualification and mean it. The transformation was witnessed by the entire imperial court, where before Adrian had been feared and avoided, now he was respected in a different way. People approached him with problems instead of hiding them, sought his counsel because they trusted his judgment rather than simply obeying his authority. The change in how people interacted with him was subtle but profound, and Adrian realized that actual power came not from making people afraid, but from earning their genuine respect. 6 months after the war ended, Vivian announced she was organizing a charitable foundation focused on supporting families affected by the conflict. Widows and orphans who'd lost breadwinners, soldiers returning with injuries that prevented them from working, communities destroyed by fighting that needed resources to rebuild. She presented the plan to Adrian in his study one evening with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she expected resistance. He listened to the entire proposal, asked clarifying questions about funding and logistics, and then said, "When do we start?" "We." "Yes. You didn't think I'd let you do this alone, did you?" Vivian's smile was brilliant. "I thought I might have to convince you that it was worthwhile. It's more than worthwhile. It's necessary. And if the Duchess of Blackwell is going to create the most influential charitable organization in the empire, she's going to need the Duke's full support. They worked on the foundation together, and Adrian discovered he was good at organizational logistics in ways that had nothing to do with military strategy, good at connecting resources with needs, good at cutting through bureaucracy to make things happen efficiently. But more than that, he discovered he enjoyed it, enjoyed seeing tangible results from their efforts, enjoyed working beside Vivian on something that mattered beyond politics and power. 1 year after their wedding, they hosted an anniversary celebration that became legendary for completely different reasons than the wedding itself. Where the wedding had been cold formality and political performance, the anniversary was genuine warmth. Adrian and Vivian moved through the gathering together, actually enjoying conversations rather than enduring them. They danced multiple times, and each dance looked less like obligation and more like two people who genuinely wanted to be near each other. Crown Prince Cedric cornered Adrian near the end of the evening with an expression of amused approval. "You've become boring, Blackwell," the prince said, disgustingly domestic, completely uninteresting. "Thank you. That wasn't a compliment. I'm choosing to interpret it as one anyway." Cedric laughed. "Fair enough. For what it's worth, I think this version of you is considerably more useful to the Empire than the cold bastard you used to be. High praise from someone who once suggested I learn to treat my emotions like adults, instead of tactical liabilities. I stand by that assessment." The prince's expression turned serious. "You've done something remarkable, Adrian. You've actually changed, fundamentally. Most people spend their entire lives being the same person in different circumstances. You became someone different. I had good motivation." They both looked across the room to where Vivian was in animated conversation with Lady Markham and several other noblewomen, her hands gesturing as she made some point about Reconstruction policy. "She's extraordinary," Cedric said. "Don't mess it up." "I'm trying not to. Try harder." After the guests left and the manor was quiet, Adrian found Vivian on the balcony overlooking the gardens. She was still in her celebration gown, but she'd taken down her hair and was leaning against the railing looking up at the stars. He joined her without speaking, and they stood in comfortable silence. 1 year, Vivian said finally, feels longer, in a good way or a bad way. Both. So much has happened. The war. The foundation. Learning to actually be married instead of just going through the motions. Any regrets? She turned to look at him fully. Not a single one. You. Adrian thought about the cold, controlled man he'd been a year ago. Thought about how that version of himself would have approached this marriage as a strategic obligation to be managed rather than a relationship to be built. Thought about all the ways jealousy and possession would have destroyed something precious if he hadn't learned to choose differently. No regrets, he said, but a lot of gratitude. For what? For you not giving up on me when you had every reason to. For being willing to see past the person I was to who I could become. For teaching me that trust isn't weakness and vulnerability isn't failure. Vivian's eyes were bright. You did the actual work. I just gave you a reason to try. You were the only reason that mattered. He kissed her under stars that had witnessed a century of Blackwell family history, and this moment felt more significant than any military victory or political triumph. This was the real achievement. Learning to love someone without destroying them. Learning to be loved without viewing it as a threat. The years that followed were not perfect. There were conflicts and challenges and moments where old patterns tried to reassert themselves. The Empire faced new crises that required Adrian's strategic mind and Vivian's diplomatic skill. The foundation grew beyond what either of them had imagined, creating ripple effects that changed how the Empire treated its most vulnerable citizens. But through all of it, they remained partners. Not in the superficial way that nobility often used the term, but in the genuine sense of two people building something together that neither could create alone. Adrian never completely lost the capacity for jealousy, but he learned to recognize it as information about his own insecurity rather than evidence of Vivian's betrayal. Learned to feel it and let it pass without acting on impulses that would damage what they'd built. Vivian never stopped challenging him, never became the compliant wife that imperial society expected. She built her own reputation as someone whose insights on policy and governance were valuable independent of her marriage, and Adrian learned to take pride in her accomplishments without needing to control or direct them. 5 years after their wedding, during a quiet evening in their study while both worked on separate projects in comfortable proximity, Vivian set down her pen and looked at Adrian with an expression he couldn't quite read. What? He asked. I was just thinking about something Lady Ashford said at our wedding reception, about how I was making a mockery of the marriage. Adrian's expression darkened. That woman is probably miserable in her own life and took it out on us. I know, but she wasn't entirely wrong. What do you mean? We did make a mockery of what marriage is supposed to be for people like us. Political arrangement, social climbing, carefully managed appearances with no actual substance underneath. She smiled. We took something that was supposed to be cold and transactional and turned it into something real. We're terrible at being proper nobility. Adrian set down his own work and crossed to where she sat. Then I hope we continue to be terrible at it for the rest of our lives. That's the plan. They kissed with the comfortable familiarity of people who'd learned each other's rhythms and preferences through years of practice. And Adrian felt the same sense of gratitude he'd felt on their anniversary, but deepened by time and accumulated moments of choosing each other. The cold Duke of Blackwell, who'd married Lady Vivian Ashbourne in a calculated political arrangement, no longer existed. In his place was someone who'd learned that the strongest thing a person could do wasn't suppress emotion, but feel everything and still choose love. Someone who'd discovered that power came not from control, but from trust. Someone who'd been transformed by loving someone brave enough to demand he become worthy of her. The Empire remembered them not because of military victories or political maneuvers, though those were significant. They were remembered because their marriage became a story that transcended politics and power. A story about two people who'd started with nothing but legal contracts and built something that looked like actual love. Not the romanticized version from fairy tales, but the kind of love that survived crisis and conflict and the daily work of choosing someone over and over again, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. Years later, when historians wrote about the Blackwell dynasty, they would note that the empire's most feared duke had been transformed by a marriage he'd never wanted, that the woman he'd tried to possess had instead freed him from the prison of his own making. But Adrian and Vivian never thought about legacy or history. They were too busy living the kind of life that only became possible when two people were brave enough to be vulnerable with each other. Too busy building a partnership that honored both their strengths without requiring either to be less than they were. Too busy loving each other in ways that felt revolutionary precisely because they were so devastatingly simple. And in quiet moments, when Adrian looked at Vivian and felt that familiar mix of gratitude and wonder that she'd chosen to stay, he understood something fundamental about what it meant to be human. Strength wasn't the absence of feeling. It was the courage to feel everything and still remain open. Power wasn't the ability to control others. It was the wisdom to recognize what control actually cost. And love, real love, the kind worth having, that required becoming someone capable of trusting another person with your whole heart, even though they could destroy you, required being someone worthy of that same trust in return. The cold Duke of Blackwell had learned those lessons the hard way, through loss and transformation and the kind of brutal honesty that stripped away everything except what actually mattered. And what mattered, in the end, was standing beside someone extraordinary and knowing you'd earned the right to be there, not through birthright or title or strategic manipulation, but through the hardest work anyone could do, becoming a person worthy of genuine love. Adrian Blackwell had spent 32 years being untouchable, and 3 years learning how to be human. And when he looked back at his life in rare moments of reflection, he couldn't identify a single achievement that mattered more than that transformation. Not the battles won or treaties signed or crises resolved, but the moment he'd stopped trying to own Vivian's heart and started trying to deserve it. That was the victory that actually changed everything. That was the war worth winning, and he'd spend the rest of his life grateful he'd been forced to fight it.